These lectures are titled Theories of Human Development, Part 2. The lecturer is Dr. Malcolm Watson. Dr. Watson is a professor of psychology and chair of the Social Science School Council at Brandeis University, where he has been teaching for over 25 years. He received his PhD in developmental psychology at the University of Denver. Dr. Watson was also the recipient of the first Michael Laban-Walzer Award for Excellence in Teaching at Brandeis. Outside of his teaching, Dr. Watson is an active researcher. His areas of interest include the development of symbolic play in children, the development of drawing and art in children, children's understanding of family roles and family conflicts, and the causes of aggression and violence in children and adolescents. He has published numerous articles in journals and books and has also edited several books. His research has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Dr. Watson prepared the course guide that comes with these lectures. The course guide includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, a timeline, biographical notes, and a bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture.
Hello. In the last lecture, we introduced Piaget's theory and we discussed the basic process of equilibration between assimilation and accommodation. And in this lecture, we'll begin with a discussion of how major equilibria define Piaget's four major stages. And then we'll discuss in more detail Piaget's first and second stages, the sensory motor period and the preoperational period. And we'll focus on the development of symbol use in the second stage. Now, according to Piaget, we're constantly reaching new levels of understanding and forming new levels of equilibria. And we mentioned how there is constantly this equilibrium formed between assimilation and accommodation. At times, however, there are so many new levels of understanding that converge that we reach a new major equilibrium that cuts across all of the little pieces of information that we're trying to understand. And these new levels cause a major reorganization in the structure of our thinking. Piaget called these shifts to new levels stages. Now, let me give you an analogy. Think of a person that's climbing a mountain range as our analogy. And the person slowly but gradually makes progress up a steep grade. When she reaches the top, she can now see vistas that were not available to her before. She has a qualitatively different situation in front of her than she had before. She'll see that she has yet other steep grades and challenges to meet. Challenges she wasn't even aware of before she started this climb and before she reached this particular level. And that's in some ways the way Piaget looked at his stages. Stages are defined as qualitative shifts in one's way of thinking, a reorganization of both one's understanding and also the mental tools, the strategies that we have to solve problems. Stages are not simply quantitative additions to one's knowledge or skill. Let me give you an example from language development. Of course, kids add vocabulary. That's a quantitative addition. But early on, they start learning just by hearing things enough and gaining experience. They learn how to say things correctly. Like a child will say, my feet, or my toys, or I drank milk. But there comes a period of time, as many of you have observed or know about, when they start shifting to an incorrect form. When they said my feet previously, they'll now say my feets, or I drinked milk. When we see this happen, we realize that this person has developed rules. For example, the use of plurals in English by adding s or es, and by the use of past tense on verbs. And now this person applies these rules in general to all situations, even cases where they're irregular forms and the person had it right before. You can't explain these rules as simple quantitative shifts or additions. You have to explain these as qualitative shifts, shifts in strategy, reorganizations. And that was what was of most interest to Piaget, this reorganization of structure on how we think. Also for Piaget, each stage is based on development in a previous stage. One can't function at stage 3, for example, without having the skills that emerged in stages 1 and 2. So in this way, in Piaget's stages, the order or the sequence of the stages is invariant. Now, Freud and Erikson also had stages, as you recall, and the order of their stages was invariant, but the stages were much more descriptive. Piaget's stages follow this logical necessity to the order. Whether you believe his stages are a good way of explaining development or not, when you look at the stages, it's difficult to think of abilities at one stage being possible before the abilities of the previous stage having developed. There's a logical necessity and a hierarchy to these stages. Piaget provided typical ages for his stages, and people get hung up and lost on the ages of the stages and are they correct or not. But his ages were not so important to him. They gave the typical ages, but he realized some children developed through the stages at a faster rate than other children. The ages were just guidelines. Piaget believed then that it was the order, the invariant order of the stages, and the logical progression that was important. He also believed his stages were universal in two senses. First, he thought that all neurologically normal people, regardless of their culture, would develop through his sequence of stages. And second, more in the line of looking at the generality of the stages, he thought that a person that was in any given stage would be in that stage for practically all of his or her development in all domains. So whether we're observing mathematical understanding or social skills or conservation skills or whatever else we talk about, a person is in a particular stage once they've consolidated their skills. And in that way, the stage is universal across all aspects of that person's life. We'll come back to this later on whether this is a good idea or not. Because Piaget's primary goal was to describe the whole sequence of development and how humans get from their cognitive level when they're born to where they are when they're an adult, at an adult level of thinking, he tried to explain how each stage grew out of the previous stage. And based on his observations, because he was, as I mentioned, a keen observer of children, and his views of the reasoning of children at different ages, Piaget believed that there were 4 major stages of cognitive development. He didn't just pick these arbitrarily. This is how he saw the major qualitative shifts. He often called these major stages periods. So let me give you a brief overview of the 4 periods. We're going to talk about the details and the definitions later as we go through. His first period is called the sensory motor period. It begins at birth and lasts until about 18 to 24 months of age, give or take a few years. No, I'm just joking. Somewhere during infancy, this is this stage. It starts out being based on reflex schemes that babies are born with, and it ends with children's development of symbol use. The second period is called the pre-operational period. It begins at about 18 to 24 months of age. It lasts until about 6 to 7 years of age, so it's essentially a period of development during the preschool years. And it starts out based on the basic symbolic skills, and then it covers the period when the child learns to master these symbolic skills, to be a symbolic thinker, a master symbolic thinker. The third period is called the concrete operational period. It begins at about 6 to 7 years. It lasts until about 11 or 12 years, so this is occurring during middle childhood. It starts out with the children's emerging use of multiple representations and cognitive operations. We'll define those later. And it lasts until formal thinking emerges. And the fourth and last period is called the formal operational period. It begins at about 11 to 12 years. It lasts throughout adulthood. However, Piaget believed that it was during adolescence that this way of thinking was mastered. And although adults continue to learn throughout their lives and the processes apply, Piaget saw no evidence for additional major reorganizations in our thinking during adulthood. He thought once we reach formal operations, this was the way we use our strategies. It was during this last period then that people develop this ability to reason hypothetically, and they become highly abstract in their ways of thinking. So now let me talk about the stages in more detail, and we're going to talk about the first two stages today, and then in the next lecture we'll go on to the subsequent stages. And I have to mention at the beginning, I can't cover all that Piaget discovered. He had many findings that are important, but I'll try to cover the highlights that I hope will make sense out of his sequence of stages. Let's talk about then the sensory motor period. It's aptly named. It's during this period that all that a child knows is based on the information that comes in through the senses and the motoric actions that he can perform in the world and on things. It's sensory and it's motor. You see, at birth, the child gives no evidence of having symbolic skills. Piaget argued this, but I think this is true. He doesn't have an ability to evoke symbolic representations of objects or symbolic memories of objects. Now, a symbol can be defined as a thing, an object, an idea, an image, or an action that refers to or stands for something else. And when you have a symbol, often we call the thing it refers to the referent. A symbol then stands for a referent. And a symbol can be differentiated from the referent. So, for example, the word dog in English is a symbol for the actual animal. But a dog's head is not truly differentiated as a symbol from the entire dog. A dog's head, if you see it, can make you think about a dog, but it's part of the dog. So in pretend play, a child may use a stick as a symbol for a car. Or we may conjure up a mental image of a car, and this mental image in our mind is also a symbol for a car. It stands for a car. We're going to talk about symbol use later, but I need to give that at the beginning here because that is not what babies have when they come into the world. It's crucial to realize that if they have no symbol use, these little kids have to live in the present. They're dependent on their sensory input and their overt actions, as I said. They're living in the here and now. This doesn't mean that this child has no memory whatsoever, however. Children have memory, otherwise we'd argue they couldn't learn anything. Memory shows that they've learned. They recognize familiar objects. They recognize familiar things. They use their schemes to assimilate objects. They also develop intentions and anticipations. They can use one thing to signal that something else will follow. They're learning about means-end causality, about three-dimensional space. But when we talk about memory, it's usually what's called recognition memory. They see something, they can apply their scheme, and they can recognize it. They're pretty poor at recall memory, at just evoking something out of nothing and bringing it about. The major developmental goal, as Piaget saw it for this period for the child, is to learn how the real world works. I mean by the real world, the physical world. How it works, how to deal with it, how to master things in the real world. It means learning that objects are permanent in the real world, that they exist whether you see them or not, having enough experience to recognize that. Recognizing how three-dimensional space works, that you can walk around things. For example, if there's a table in your way, you can walk around it to get to where you want to go. Things that seem simple for us. Babies have to learn all of that kind of stuff. And having enough experience with the real world that the child develops the prerequisites, the experience for symbol use, which will emerge during the second year of life. Now, Piaget divided his sensory motor period into 6 substages. I really don't think it's that important that a person keep every substage exactly straight, but going through them generally will give you the sense of the sequence that's happening in this development. First, children are born with some basic schemes to get them started. We mentioned that in the last lecture. They're born with these reflexive action schemes: sucking, looking, grasping. This is how they act on their world and know their world. They come into the world utilizing these schemes. They're like reflexes. They can't help themselves. They're reflexive because the child doesn't have any voluntary control, doesn't anticipate his actions. For example, on grasping, if you put something in a child's hand, as you realize, the child grasps it. It's not like he has a choice. If you put something in his mouth, he sucks it. The second stage, this would be the first stage. We're born with this. We've already developed this prenatally, if you will. But at the second stage, what really happens, I think, is what we've already talked about that we called a 7-week shift. At some time around 7 to 8 weeks after birth, major portions of the cortex begin to fire, and there's an extra neural development, and it makes possible association areas of the cortex that weren't there before. Piaget didn't exactly know this when he came up with this, but what he said fits. A child shifts to being voluntary and showing voluntary control of behavior. So, for example, a child can now decide to grasp an object or not. It's voluntary. Can choose to look at an object or not, or suck an object or not. The reflexive automatic nature is lost, and everything becomes voluntary. The reflexive part seemed to be just a way of getting the kid started. The child starts to show intentions and the beginnings of means-end understanding. That is, what things do you do to create these kinds of results or ends and how they're connected. In the third stage of the sensory motor period, children develop this sense of means-end causality. For example, now they'll grasp an object, in this case it's the means, in order to bring it into their line of vision so that they can look at it, the end. And it seems to be this intentional case of doing one thing to bring about something else, and they start learning about all the actions they take that have results. They seem to be processing this or learning what these connections are. In the fourth substage, children pay attention to variations in the ends, in the end results, and to what caused these variations. In some way, it's like a kid playing with theme and variations as he explores the world. And in the fifth stage, he takes this further. Children systematically experiment with varying the means in order to test the end results. The key word here is systematic. They seem to look like miniature scientists on a sensory motor level. Through trial and error, they seem to be more systematic as they're exploring and trying to figure out the causality and the means-end relationships, more than they did in the random way before. Let me give you an example. This is one child that I observed, but this you can see again and again in kids. Child was sitting in the high chair, and he had his tray in front of him and some food on the tray, and he accidentally dropped the food off, pushed it off. It fell to the floor. Pretty cool. So he did it again. And dropping the food to the floor became the end. Pushing it off, dropping it became his means. And he got really interested in this. So he over and over again pushed food off his tray. But then he observed by accident, I think, that how it fell and where it fell depended on where he dropped it. That's a pretty profound insight for this little kid. And then he proceeded to systematically varying the dropping of the food and also the force with which he threw it at different times. And he'd watch the changes in these actions, the changes they'd have on where it fell, how fast it went down, the trajectory, if you will. I'm reading a lot in. But this is what it looked like this kid was doing, this little experiment. He could now drop food, the same old means, to find different ends. He could vary the way he dropped it, the means, to look at the effect in a systematic way. But his mom came along and bent down and started picking up some of the food. A new end. The same old means of dropping the food, and mom picks it up and puts it back on the tray. So now he started doing it and shifted to seeing what he could get mom to do. Then mom got really exasperated with him. A new end. Drop it off and see if mom will get frustrated and upset. And he really looked like he was doing experiments. He then did it with other objects. You put something on his tray, toys, other objects, he'd do the same thing, see what happened. And one of the things he did is see how long he could keep people going, playing this game, being part of his experiment. This is an example of a small sensory motor scientist at work. The sixth substage of the sensory motor period usually occurs somewhere between about 14 and 24 months in kids. Children make a transition into the next period. It's sort of the end of this stage is vague, it becomes the next period too. With all of their experience with means and ends, and with causality, with dealing with objects in the world, they begin to show insight learning. That is, they perform an action in their mind without actually going through the sensory motor trial and error learning. They seem to show a budding symbol use. Piaget described a case where a child was trying to open a matchbox, one of those little wooden matchboxes with small wooden matches in, couldn't get it open, and then looked at it, and with her mouth opened her mouth, looked at it again, and reached in and opened it. You could say the child was still doing actions, but it's like the child not just doing trial and error until she eventually got it open, but the child doing some insight learning, thinking about it, in this case using sort of a prop, an action, but almost a symbolic action, to then go ahead and try to do this task. They show then the beginning of symbol use. And it's not just trial and error learning anymore. They do it internally. One thing stands for something else. They think about these things. They begin to show this, of course, in language, the primary symbolic system that we use as humans. Not only do they use words that stand for other things, they develop a word order, a beginning syntax in their speech. They begin showing simple pretend play. They'll pretend to drink from a cup or to sleep on something that stands for a pillow. They'll pretend to talk on a telephone, as they've seen other people in their house do. And there's a spurt in recall memory. They can now think of things that are no longer present in their environment without the aid of cues. They can go after something that's not there, act like they're searching for things that aren't there. It now seems that there are neurological changes at this time that in fact make possible the use of these accompanying mental associations and symbol use. Piaget argued how it was the previous experiences that led to this development. That's probably true, but that's probably also in conjunction with maturational neurological changes that make it possible. So symbol use is beginning. If children have reached this new plateau or level of thinking, they're not tied to the here and now any longer. They no longer require sensory input to think of things, nor do they require the need to act overtly on their environment in order to think about it and to work through causality and see how things work. You see what a profound change that is? They're not tied to the here and now. They're no longer sensory motor. This transition then takes them into Piaget's second stage that he called the pre-operational period. And it was symbol use that provided the transition. You get the impression that the development of symbol use is a major breakthrough. I think I've mentioned it before. Symbol use, symbol use, symbol use. That seems to be a big shift in the development of humans. The task of the second period, this is during the preschool years, is really for the child to perfect the ability to have anything stand for anything else. The master symbol user can use anything for anything, is really adept at bouncing around in symbols and using them as part of a system, like a language system. This is what seems to be going on cognitively as the main task, as Piaget saw it. He called it the pre-operational period because it was before operations come in. And I'm going to talk about operations later and what that means. But let's focus on the mastery of symbol use. So for example, early on in a child's symbol use, she often will need external props that are highly similar to the referent to use as a symbol. Later on, again, she can use anything that stands for anything. Let me give you an example of this sequence of development that happens at the transition from the sensory motor period to the pre-operational period. This is some research I did with Elaine Jakowitz. We showed kids a sequence of objects and wanted to see how they could symbolize or use these objects in a pretend play situation. In fact, we'd get them started by having somebody model these objects and then seeing if the kids would also do it this way. And we presented them in a random order, not in the same order. And what we discovered was kids didn't really blindly imitate what we did. If they understood something, they would use it in pretend play. They would do it as the model showed it. But if they didn't understand it, they wouldn't use it. They'd look at you and bounce back to some earlier level or do something else. Let me give you one case, and this was talking on a telephone, a very simple pretend task that a lot of kids will do. We started out with a real telephone. Can you pick up a receiver? I should say a telephone receiver. Can you pick up a receiver and talk into it? The next was we used a pretend telephone, a little toy telephone that was very much the same shape, the same function and size. Could the child pick up the toy telephone and have a little pretend conversation? Then we made a shift. We used something that was similar, but a little different. We used a walkie-talkie that didn't look so much like a telephone receiver. We also used a banana that looks like a telephone receiver. Of course, it has a completely different function. Then we shifted further. We used a block of wood that was sort of ambiguous and nondescript. And could the kids use the block of wood and use it as a telephone? Then we used something that was tough. We used a toy car. Could a child use a toy car and talk into a toy car? And eventually we used what we thought might be the most extreme, no object at all. We just held up a toy telephone as if we were holding it in our hand and talked to it to an imaginary object. Whatever order we presented these in, kids went through that order in the same order that I just gave it to you. Between 16 and 24 months, they first showed that it was very easy. All of them could talk into the real phone and, in fact, the toy telephone. Later on, as they got a little older, they got better and they could talk into the banana. But when they could talk into the banana, at first, they still couldn't use the block or the toy car. Eventually, they could use the block and then the toy car. And last of all, and most difficult, was the imaginary object. In fact, some of the kids at 24 months could do it, but it was so difficult that a lot of kids never got to that stage. One little girl, for example, when we talked with an imaginary object and it was her turn, she looked around for an object. There was no object present. She picked up a little piece of lint and held it up and talked into it. She needed some prop, some object to use. My argument is that the development of symbol use means that you distance the symbol from the referent, that you can use anything for anything. So by the time a kid is 4, certainly 5, they can do it easily, as we can as adults. This frees the child from the present environment. She can now think about anything, conjure up anything, talk about anything, dwell on the past, dwell on the future as well as the present. What a breakthrough. And paradoxically, by freeing oneself from concrete reality, a person gains greater flexibility and adaptability to reality. Now, mastering entire symbol systems becomes a major developmental achievement for kids. And this takes kids then to the transition to the next stage. But in addition to this kind of mastery, Piaget also talked about the errors that children would make, what they can't do as well as what they can do. And it's important because sometimes when you look at errors, you can learn about what's going on in their heads. For example, even though they're developing symbol use, kids have a very difficult time representing things in multiple ways, looking at things from different viewpoints at the same time. Piaget called this centration. They center on one factor or one aspect of a situation rather than decenter on multiple factors or aspects of a particular object or a situation. Adults have, or older kids have, decentration ability. Kids don't have decentration ability, if you want to look at it this way. And this leads to problems with perspective taking. So they have a perspective on things. Other people have a perspective on things, but they have a very difficult time coordinating these two, seeing that they both exist at the same time. Piaget did a classic study called the Three Mountain Task, in which he laid out a model, like a papier-mâché mountain model of 3 different mountains with a few little objects like a little cottage on one and so forth. And he had the kids look at this model and walk around it and see it from all perspectives. In fact, as they were at each side of the model, they could pick out a picture that looked like what they saw from that vantage point. And they could go around and find this. And then if you asked them, how does this model of the 3 mountains look to you? They could pick out the correct picture. But if you put somebody across in a different vantage point, on a different side, and said, what does the model look like to this other person? They would pick out, the little kids, the preschoolers, would pick out their viewpoint again. They got confused and they would go back to their own viewpoint rather than the viewpoint of another person. Piaget said this is egocentric thinking. Egocentric in the sense that they tended to prefer and focus on their viewpoint and not somebody else's. He later regretted that he used the word egocentric, because egocentric had so many connotations for people as being something like selfishness or egotistical. He didn't mean that. He said egocentric is a cognitive deficit that's just part of development. They can't look at it both ways. There are a lot of cases of this lack of perspective taking for kids. At one time, for example, one of my sons went to the dentist and got a little cheap plastic ring as a gift. He was very interested in it. And when we went home at night, he was still playing with it. He went to bed. It was dark. I was in bed in the other room. He had at least enough perspective to realize I was still awake, I guess. He yelled out, "Dad, which finger does a ring go on?" He's in the dark, I'm in another room. Being a bad dad and I was tired, I said, "The third finger, go to sleep." There was this long pause. And then he said, "Is this the right finger?" And I said, "Yes." Now, if you count your fingers, is it 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, count them from any direction. He got confused that I could see his perspective. He had enough sense, enough perspective to realize that I might have the answer and could tell him, but he got confused when you put these things together. And kids often get confused in their perspectives. And that will set us up for what develops next in the next stage, and we'll talk about that next time. Thank you. Hello. Last time we talked about Piaget's sensory-motor and preoperational periods of development. Today we're going to continue the discussion of Piaget's stages of development. We left the child at the end of the preoperational period with the mastery of symbol use. And we also talked about what preschoolers could and could not do. Today I'd like to continue that and talk about what they can't do as a way of understanding the 5 to 7 year shift. This shift is a pivotal transition to Piaget's third period, the concrete operational period. And then I would like to discuss what he meant by an operation, this term, and this important concept for him that developed during this stage. So despite all of children's accomplishments and the mastery of symbols, we talked about some of the errors they had, the things they couldn't do during the pre-operational period. The problem they had of decentering and considering multiple perspectives at the same time, the problems in perspective taking, the problems they had when they had to combine things and therefore showed a good deal of egocentric thinking. When we look at errors that children make, it's a good way of then trying to make sense of what they can do in the next stage. Sometimes preschoolers, particularly preschoolers, say poetic and humorous things. It's really because of their lack of perspective taking, of their cognitive deficits that are common for them at this stage, but sometimes it's cute, sort of funny. Let me give you one example. This actually came from Tchaikovsky, who was a Russian author of children's stories. And he told about this instance. A mother was drying off her preschool-aged daughter after the girl's bath. And as she was drying off the girl with the towel, the girl looked down at her naked body and exclaimed with this excitement of discovery, "I'm barefoot all over." Now, this is sort of a delightful and poetic way of expressing something, but it's based on the child centering on only one aspect of her situation. It's very likely that she looked down, saw a lot of bare skin, probably a thought about when she'd seen bare skin in the past, when she looked down and seen her bare feet. She equated the one incident with the other, what she saw now, and said this. A lack of perspective taking, as in this example, is also an illustration of how a child might assimilate a new situation to an old scheme, one of being barefoot. I just want to point that out because we had talked about assimilation and accommodation before. In this case, the child didn't fully accommodate to the new aspects of the situation. So the child distorted reality, albeit in a poetic way. Because of this same lack of ability, it's a lack of ability to consider multiple perspectives or pieces of information. Preschool children also have a difficult time understanding how someone else's mind works, how we come to believe what we believe. Nowadays, there's a whole area of research that we call theory of mind research. But what it really means is how little kids develop some naive theory or conception of how their mind works and how other people's minds work. And there are several researchers in this area. Two of them are John Flavel and Henry Wellman. And they have tracked the development of children's ability to understand how someone develops false beliefs or beliefs that vary from one's own. Two other people, Wimmer and Perner, did a classic study in this area, and there have been many studies done along this same line. But let me give you this as an example. In a situation, you put down a little kid to one side of you, and the experimenter sets up a little story, often done either with pictures or more likely with little dolls, to act out the situation. And here's how the story goes. One doll person comes into his room and hides a ball in a drawer in his cupboard and then leaves the room. Then another person comes into the room, another doll, let's say the mother, takes the ball out of the drawer and puts it under the bed. And then she leaves. And then the other person comes back in to get the ball. Now, you ask the kid who's been watching this, where does the child go? Where does this child go to look for the ball? What do you expect that they're going to say? Well, 3-year-olds almost always will say, the kid will look for the ball under the bed where the mom put it. It's only about 4 or 5 years of age that kids consistently say, this little kid's going to go in and look in the drawer for the ball because he still believes it's there. He doesn't know that the mom moved it. You see, they have a problem on figuring out what they know versus what somebody else knows. It sounds like our perspective-taking problem. It's also a problem in trying to figure out how somebody else thinks. It's called false belief because this little kid in the story could have a real belief that the ball's in the drawer, but it's a false belief because of lack of information. Now, development is not an all or none process. Children develop gradually during this period of the preschool years and the school years. They improve in these abilities. I have to say, in these abilities, even as adults, though, we show egocentric thinking, problems with perspective taking, problems of coordinating things, especially, I think, when we're under stress, have too many things on our mind. It's not that little kids can't do it and we, from then on, can do it. But little kids are notoriously bad at these kinds of tasks, and they get pretty good. So many changes in thinking emerge during the transition from the preschool years to the school years that many have come to call this period the 5 to 7 year shift. Sheldon White was the person who first coined this term. What actually develops during this transition period, the 5 to 7 year shift? Well, many now believe that there's probably some neurological changes in processing capacity that make possible these changes in cognition. But we're still not clear about what all of the neurological changes are. Probably It's based on a combination of neurological changes and past experiences dealing with perspective-taking issues, and this emerging mastery of symbolic systems and symbol use, that 5 to 6-year-olds develop this ability to represent a thing or a person or a situation in multiple ways at the same time, to switch back and forth easily between these representations and to compare them and to coordinate them. And this is called the development of multiple representational ability. The ability to look at things in 2 ways at the same time, or more than 2 ways at the same time. You see, little kids, 3-year-olds, even 4-year-olds, have a very difficult time seeing the world from 2 perspectives. We've already mentioned that. In fact, they seem to have this belief that everything has to be only one way, that there's only one representation of the world. Even though at times they can shift to another representation, they just can't see that there could be 2 simultaneous representations. I want to give you a quote that I think sort of captures this from an unlikely source. This is from James Barrie's Peter Pan. I'm now talking about Tinkerbell here. Tinkerbell, if you recall from the story, is very jealous of Wendy. And this is one of those cases where Tinkerbell tries to kill Wendy because of her jealousy. Tink was not all bad, or rather she was all bad just now. But on the other hand, sometimes she was all good. Fairies have to be one thing or the other, because being so small, they unfortunately have room for one feeling only at a time. They are, however, allowed to change, only it must be a complete change. At present, she was full of jealousy for Wendy. It's interesting that sometimes great truths about development are delightfully captured in children's literature by insightful authors, like James Barrie in this case. Let me give you an example. A child may now be able to understand that a person can be represented as having a false belief in something, at the same time represented as wanting to tell the truth, but being in error because of this lack of information, can't tell the truth. Likewise, though, another person might have a valid belief about something, but also be represented as wanting to deceive the child, and thus not giving out correct information, even though what the person believed was true. Kids now are better at detecting what's true and what isn't true, and whether the other person intended to deceive you or in fact is making a mistake because of a lack of information. Along with this wonderful ability also comes, unfortunately, the ability for children to deceive much better. Little preschoolers, even though they sometimes try, are lousy liars. You get to be the 5 to 7 year shift and kids get pretty good at lying and deceiving because of this cognitive ability. They can use strategies to compete. So in a competitive game or in a sport, they can figure out what the things you could do to try to win or deceive another person. They can also understand the complex needs of somebody else and complex rules. The list goes on and on. Numerous changes that can be made in children's thinking and in their ability, in their social skills as well as their academic skills. These basic changes, this multiple representation, matches Piaget's observations and his belief that children enter a 3rd stage, again, that he called the concrete operational period. What's in a name? The concrete operational period. Well, for Piaget, an operation is a mental transformation that a child can perform on something or idea, and that can also be reversed or brought back to the original state by a complementary transformation. Let me see if I can give you some examples to explain what I just said. A perfect example of an operation comes from basic mathematical operations. In fact, I think that's where Piaget got the word. If we have 4 in a mathematical problem, and then we add 3 to it, we have performed a transformation on the 4. We've turned it into 7. And this transformation of 4 to 7 can also be reversed by another transformation. We can subtract 3 from the 7 and turn it back into 4. Seems so obvious. In this case, though, subtraction is a reversible transformation of addition, just like division is a reversible transformation of multiplication. And addition is considered a mathematical operation, as is subtraction, multiplication, division. Let's go back to the case of the kid hiding the ball and trying to figure out whether the kid understands this idea of false belief. If the child hides the ball in the drawer, that was an operation that this kid transformed the situation, and then it's transformed subsequently by the mother moving the ball to be under the bed. And this operation can be reversed by the transformation of moving the ball back to the drawer. So operations can function in mathematics, of course, but they also function in nature. And Piaget pointed out they function in social situations. They function in virtually all domains of our lives. Some people don't find it handy to think of children's thinking in terms of operations, but this is the way Piaget found it helpful and easy to think of these transformations that were being done. Another important point to remember about operations is that they need not be physically performed. They can be done mentally or symbolically. Remember now, as we go during this 5 to 7 year shift and now into the elementary school years, kids are master symbol users. That's what they've developed. And another point to remember is that these operations are made possible because the child can simultaneously represent multiple aspects of a problem and compare them. So the child can take account of the way things are in state A before a transformation has occurred, how things are in state B after a transformation has occurred, and also what the transformation is. And this is a multiple representation ability. The idea of reversible operations means that you can consider it both ways. You can put it all together. Piaget, now, he called it the concrete operational period. That's operations. I hope that part's clear. What is this word concrete? What did he mean? Some people have mistakenly thought that Piaget meant that concrete operations was that children had to perform these operations physically on real objects. That's not what he meant. What he meant by concrete was that the mental operations, and they were mental and symbolic, but they were possible as a child considered real life situations, concrete instances of a problem, not hypothetical or not highly theoretical problems. You can do things symbolically, but you're still dealing with real-world instances that you're representing. For example, let's say we have a 7-year-old child, and that child can understand this problem. It's a problem in sort of a transitive inference problem. If John is taller than Bonnie, and Bonnie is taller than Peggy, then John is also taller than Peggy. A child can perform this inference by seriating the order of these items, can put them in order and then compare them. See, in this case, Bonnie is both shorter than someone and also taller than someone. There's a multiple representation there. She can be represented in these two ways. But this is a concrete situation. If you ask this same child to seriate a series of fractions with which he'd had no experience, or to define seriation, he probably wouldn't have the capacity. So concrete operations, being concrete, means that children are limited to specific instances for which they may have had some related experience. With further mastery of operational thinking, children end up classifying their world. They learn about relations and causality through their own logic, not just based on what they've observed. You see, before, when they started out as babies, and we talked about sensory motor period, they learned through their sensory and motor experiences with the real world. Then they became symbolic. Now, in fact, they're learning through logic. They're not just tied to observations. Let me give you another example of this. This is some work that was done by John Flavel on what he calls appearance versus reality. He showed kids, preschoolers and older kids, different kinds of tasks. Let me give you an example of one of them. He had a red fish, a cutout of a, on a piece of cardboard, if you will, of a, excuse me, it wasn't red. He had a clear or a white fish. And he would ask kids, what is this? They'd say, a fish. He'd say, what color is it? They'd say, white. No problem. What color is it really and truly? White. What does it look like to your eyes? White. No matter how you ask the question, no problem. Then he'd show them a piece of clear plastic that was red, transparent plastic. Say, what's this? Oh, a piece of plastic. What color is it? Red. Is it really red? Yes. Go through all of that. Then he'd put the red plastic over the fish. And he'd say, what color does this fish look like it is now? What does it look like to your eyes? And they'd say, red. He'd say, but what color is it really and truly? Not just what it looks like, but what color is it really and truly? And 3-year-olds would say, red. And 4-year-olds were a little wishy-washy. Sometimes they still say red. By 5, got it. It's white. Really and truly, it's white. He'd pull it away, say, what color is it now? They'd say, white. Well, when you put this on, what color does it become? Red. Well, is it really and truly red, or does it just look like it's red? It's really and truly red. He did some strange things like this. He had a little fake rock. Have you ever seen these fake rocks, but it's really a sponge? He said, what is this? They'd say, it's rock. He'd say, feel it. They'd, see, it's a sponge. They'd say, oh, yeah, it's a sponge. Okay, but what does it look like? A sponge. Or they might say a rock. But what is it really and truly? They'd say a rock. They'd get confused. The point is the 3-year-olds consistently get confused between appearance and reality, and they go one way or the other, but they say the same thing. 5-year-olds, they get it. And there are many kinds of related tasks that show this kind of progression. Now, some people said, oh, you're just confusing him with the words. Well, outside of saying to a kid, say this is the correct answer, he tried everything he could to simplify the task and to say it in the simplest ways, and they still made that mistake, these 3-year-olds. It seems to be a problem, again, of this kind of multiple representation, that they can't do it both ways. And yet, by 5, they're into it. They have it. So again, this is one of the shifts that you see in how we understand our world. When I said we can go with logic and not just with the way we observe things, this is one case of that. You can say, seeing is not always believing for school-age kids. But you can't really make that statement about 3-year-olds. Okay? This is also associated with another operational ability. This comes in the belief in necessary truth. Some people have called it necessary truth. And that is the idea that some things must be true because logic says that they're this way. A person's knowledge of transformation again say certain things have to be possible or certain things are not possible. Now, in fact, magicians don't have very good audiences when they play to preschoolers because they do a trick and the preschooler says, oh, cool, but everything's magic, everything transforms. You do a magic trick for a school-age kid or an older person, and the excitement of a magician is to say, how did he do that? That can't possibly be right. There's a trick. How did he do it? And sit around and try to figure out the trick. That's the excitement about it, because I don't care what the magician did. That can't be true. That's called necessary truth. I want to now discuss 2 specific examples of concrete operational thinking that Piaget talked about. One was a development, an offshoot from Piaget's thinking. The first is conservation ability. And the second is a conceptualization of kindness that kids have. Let's talk about conservation first. The concept of conservation refers to the ability that a person has to understand what remains the same about an object or a person when some things change. In other words, a person can conserve the identity of the object amid changes. And this ability is made possible because of reversible operations, according to Piaget. And these, in turn, are made possible because of multiple representations. Let me give you a perfect example in an experiment that Piaget first performed. It's been done in this form with many variations since. You First sit down a preschooler and you show him two identical glasses filled with water or some other liquid to the same height. You make sure at first that this child says they're the same height. And trust me, if you do this with a child, usually they'll spend some time pouring back and forth to be precise, to make sure that they look exactly the same. And you ask them, is there the same amount of water in each glass, or is there a different amount? And they'll say there's the same amount. Then you take one of the glasses and pour that water into a tall, thin glass or a tall, thin beaker. Or you could go the other way and pour it into a flat plate. Let's say you pour it into a tall, thin beaker. And now the level of the liquid is higher. And you say to this child who has watched you do this, now, is it the same amount of water in both glasses, or does one have more? And guess what? 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds say, this one has more, usually pointing to the tall one. And you'll say, why? And they'll say, because it's taller. You'll say, yeah, but before, did they have the same amount or a different amount? They'll say the same amount. And now they have more, and they'll say, yeah. They'll say, well, how can that be? Did I take any away? No. How can it be? Because look at it, it's taller. You pour it back, and they say it's the same amount again. A 5, 6, 7-year-old, somewhere in this shift, won't fall for this. They'll say, oh, it's the same amount. You'll say, well, how can that be? It's taller. And they'll say, oh, yeah, it looks taller, but it's also skinnier. Or they'll say, yeah, but you just poured it in, you didn't take anything away or add anything. Or they'll say, the reversible transformation, you can pour it back, and it will be the same amount again. So again, they can consider this representation of it in two ways at the same time and talk about the transformation of this liquid. Now you can do this with other kinds of liquid as well. And you can do this with other conservation tasks. You can do it with masses of clay, or with numbers of things, or the shapes of things. You can also have conservation of people. It doesn't just refer to concrete things in the world. So for example, when I was in graduate school and I was working on my dissertation feverishly, my preschool son once got worried because he'd heard what I was doing, and he said to me, Dad, when you become a doctor, will you still be my father? And I, of course, said no. No, I didn't say no. I said, yeah. And I said, why did you ask this? The point is, he had problems that when I changed, would I still be the same? Would I be conserved in my basic identity? It's a little different than the liquid problem, but it's still a conservation thing. Can he represent me in two ways at once? He said at another time, how come you call Grandpa Dad? How can he be your dad and my grandpa at the same time? He's represented in two ways. So again, this kind of conservation of not only things in the world, but even identities, is something that school-age kids have a pretty easy time dealing with. Preschoolers have a tough time with. Even when you teach them the correct answer and give them experiences, which you can do, it doesn't generalize when they're young kids to new problems. After this age, it's easy. This is a problem sometimes for kids. So for example, when parents go through a divorce, preschool kids often have a difficult time and a stress understanding it in this regard. They believe that if their parents get a divorce, will their parents still be their parents? Because they get confused that the spousal roles might be the same as the parent-child roles. How can you get rid of one and still have the same person? And when kids are older, they don't have that kind of confusion. In fact, older kids, though they have problems with divorce, don't tend to blame themselves for it quite as much as the younger kids. Let's go back to some other aspect of this. Susan Carey did some research on this area I talked about called necessary truth. I mentioned necessary truth previously. She took the old water experiment, the conservation of the liquid in the different glasses. But surreptitiously, she put tubes into the bottoms of these glasses. So she could pump liquid in and out at any level she wanted. She could show you this thing as an adult, and you'd pour it in the tall, thin beaker, and it would be the same level as before, or it would be shorter, it would be anything like this. So it was like a magic trick. And the kids couldn't see this. Now, interestingly, she would first do tasks to see which kids had this conservation ability and which kids didn't have the conservation ability. And then she did these tricks where it would be, she'd ask them what they predicted, and when she poured it in the tall, thin beaker, it would be the same amount. Interestingly, the kids who did not have conservation were not upset at all. Huh? That's the way it came out. This is the way it is. I see it. That's what it was. I was wrong in whatever I predicted. I don't know for sure what it would be. Kids who had conservation said, that can't be right. She said, well, look, you just saw me do it. Say, it can't be right. You tricked me. And they'd look around for the trick. Necessary truth. Despite how things look, things have to be a certain way because this is their logic telling them so. Now let me shift to another issue related, I think, and it's this concept of kindness. This work was done by James Jonas, and it's in a very social domain, but I think it's related again to this concrete operations. It's a variation. He asked children to define and describe what made a person a kind person. And he gave them some very concrete examples of different social situations, asked them, are you kind in this situation, are you not? Which ones would they be kind? Basically, he wanted to get their thinking. So it wasn't just asking them for straight yes and no answers, it was asking them to sort of define it. In doing all of this work with kids at different ages, he found that preschoolers, as a rule, defined being kind in terms of absolute behaviors. So, for example, a person is kind if she shares her cookies with another kid. A person is kind if he helps another person across the street. However, school-age children define kindness in more relative terms. So, for example, they would say, a person's kind if her playmate doesn't have any cookies and is hungry, and she has a lot, and then she shares cookies with the other person. Or a person is kind if another person wants to cross the street and she can't walk very well on her own, then the first person helps her across the street. In every case, the younger kids just talked about the act. That's what defined kindness. And the older kids talked about first there had to be a need or a deficit. Call this state A. And then there had to be some way, a transformation, if you will, of amending state A, this need or deficit, making it up and bringing about state B. If the other kid has more cookies than you, giving cookies to the other kid isn't really a kind act. If the other kid is stuffed, giving cookies to the other kid isn't a kind act. If the other kid's nauseous and about ready to throw up, giving cookies to the other kid is not a kind act. You see, there has to be some need and deficit. In all of these cases, the older kids took account of it both ways. The younger kids didn't. I could go on and on. So there's so many examples of this ability that comes in with concrete operational thinking. Let me just say in conclusion, this kind of thinking makes possible many academic and cognitive accomplishments. It also makes possible higher levels of adaptation in social situations. I hope I've given some of these. Next time, we're going to continue our discussion with Piaget's fourth and final stage, the formal operational period. Thank you. Hello. In the last lecture, we left the child with the ability to reason logically and use multiple representations. But one major shortcoming in his concrete operational level of development was that he couldn't deal with problems that were highly abstract and hypothetical. I say highly abstract. From birth on, we become more and more abstract. But at the level we normally think of abstract thinking, some of the problems I'm going to talk about today, some of these levels are beyond children in middle childhood. At about the time of puberty, children show a shift to a more abstract and theoretical level of thinking. And Piaget called this transition the formal operational period. This is his fourth and final stage. In this lecture, we're going to discuss why this period is a period of formal idealistic, abstract, and hypothetical thinking. And then we'll evaluate Piaget's theory and discuss some approaches that have been used for revisions to this theoretical approach. So to begin with, what did Piaget mean by using the title formal operational? Because remember, the previous stage was concrete operational. Pre-adolescents and adolescents still use mental operations, as we talked about last time. But because of their experience with numerous specific problems and many instances, they can now extract more general and all-encompassing strategies and concepts. Abstract thinking can be thought of as an extraction of general laws and principles from a set of specific instances of very concrete real-world problems. The level of abstraction, then, is no longer tied to one concrete instance. So, for example, we talked about conservation as one of the skills or abilities that kids had. Conservation of liquid quantity that kids deal with, conservation of quantity of mass, conservation of numbers, conservation of personal identity, and many other kinds of conservations may be tried by a child. And after a lot of experience with these different cases, together, all of these cases give the child one general principle of conservation. And the general principle might be what stays the same amid change. This is the problem. Look for these situations. This is the abstract form of conservation. So when we go back to the previous stage, kids can do conservation, but I don't think they can describe what it is and define it for you. They can do the concrete instances. So Piaget called these operations formal to indicate that individuals could now deal with hypotheses or propositions in the abstract form of the proposition, regardless of the specific instances and the empirical evidence or the truth or falsehood of a particular proposition. They were not tied to concrete instances anymore. Here's a good way to think about it. When you think of formal, think of the form in formal. People now can deal with the form of things, not just the content. And because of this freedom from the concrete, adolescents can now think about and apply strategies to hypothetical situations. Adolescents also become more idealistic in their thinking, and there are different meanings for the word idealistic. But the way that I think Piaget and people mean it when they talk about the formal operational period is that people can now deal with abstract ideas, again, rather than the concrete realities and the representations of concrete realities. So, when you think of idealistic, think of the idea in idealistic. Now, there's some concrete examples that I want to give you that I think will make these abstract ideas clear. Despite the fact that we might have abstract, idealistic, formal thinking, concrete examples always help. There are a lot of studies of propositional logic and the rules that one uses to think logically, often using syllogisms. Let me give you the basic, very formal approach to this, and then I'm going to give you some more concrete examples. But one basic abstract form is if P, then Q. And this form means if P exists, then Q also exists. Now, to determine whether this proposition is false, proposition if P, then Q, one need only find one case in which P exists, but Q does not exist, to show that it's false. However, if the proposition's correct, and we assume it's correct, then one logical corollary is, if Q doesn't exist, then we know that P also does not exist. However, if Q does exist, then we can't know for sure whether P exists or not. If the first proposition is correct, if P then Q, we can't have P without also having Q, but we could have Q without having P. Now, has that lost you? For some who have experience with this kind of logic, this formal reasoning is easy and fun. But for most of us, like me, it's difficult to keep it straight, to deal with this kind of formal level. It's much easier, even for adults, to deal with the concrete examples rather than the abstract forms. Nevertheless, as adults, I want to point out, with formal operational thinking, we can learn to deal with these abstractions. We have that ability if we practice it. Let me give you now a concrete instance of this if P then Q and see if this becomes clear. If a person studies hard, then he will get good grades. In this concrete instance, if a person studies hard is P, if P, then he will get good grades. That's Q, then Q. Now, to disprove this proposition, I have to find someone who studies hard, remember that's the P, and nevertheless doesn't get good grades. He doesn't have Q. However, I'm going back to what I said before. If the proposition is correct, and we assume it's correct, then if I find someone who studies hard, I already know that he gets good grades. And I'll also know that if I find someone who doesn't get good grades, he didn't study hard. But if I find someone who does not get good grades, if I find someone who gets good grades, I said this, I know he studies hard, but if I find someone who gets good grades, do I know for sure he studies hard? In this case, it's confusing for me too. If I have Q, do I know that P exists? He gets good grades, does he study hard? And the answer is, I don't know. Because someone might get good grades for other reasons and still not study hard, we can't know for sure. Now, even there, you have to keep it straight. But you can see how you can reason this way, with one thing causing something else. In this case, in this example, we've simply taken the general abstract forms above and we've applied them to a very concrete instance. Now, the value of formal propositional logic is it doesn't matter what you put in. You can put wacky things in there. They have no case or no connection to reality. You can even put instances in that aren't true and you can still use the logic. That's the hypothetical, the level then that adolescents, in thinking in a formal way, can begin to deal. Here's another example of using syllogisms. I actually did this. I talked to an 8-year-old boy, and I was giving him some little tests. I said to him first, all men have hairy legs. I met a man. Did he have hairy legs? And the boy answered correctly. He said, yes, because you said that all men have hairy legs. I then said, I met a person with hairy legs. Was that person a man? Remember the opposite way? And the boy answered correctly again, but I'm not sure if it was for the right reason. He said, well, maybe not. He said, maybe not, because some women might also have hairy legs. I then said to him, all women have blue stripes down their backs. Okay. I saw a person with a blue striped back. Was the person a man or a woman? And this time the boy said, no one, because people don't have blue stripes down their backs. So this, I think, very concrete operational boy could handle some of the logic of these propositions when the instances were concrete and when they fit his experiences of reality. But he couldn't handle the hypothetical, non-realistic instances. I don't think it's an all or none proposition for kids. But this is an example of the concrete level of handling things. Kids can be logical, but not when you throw them into the unrealistic or the hypothetical. That ability is what comes with formal operational thinking, or one of the main abilities. And mastery of this level of thinking comes really at the end of adolescence and in young adulthood. It starts at the beginning of adolescence. And it allows a person to deal with highly abstract forms of logic, but these forms are also found in mathematics, in philosophy, in science, and certainly in hypothesis testing, the way we do experimental work. This kind of logic is also found in other fields as well. There's another aspect of formal operational thinking, and that's the emerging ability to perform operations on operations. A perfect example comes from mathematics, because operations originally for Piaget were taken from mathematical operations as his prototype, as his example. Now, the child's already learned to perform simple mathematical operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. And she may have even learned to deal with some simple abstract forms, such as using variables like A and B to stand for fixed numbers. So you could have, the simplest form we start using in algebra, like A plus 24 equals B, and a child can start dealing with that. However, truly formal operational thinking is shown when a person can perform one operation on another, or overlay one system onto another system. That's the complication that comes in later. And it's difficult to talk you through this example. But for example, you could have 2 times the whole quantity of A times B over C plus 24 divided by C equals 100. If that doesn't make sense, it's okay. But the kind of formulas you would see in algebra, where you have an operation on an operation, multiplication of a case where there's addition and division, and variables mixed in with other set numbers, fixed numbers. This is the kind of system that you get in algebra and calculus and other mathematical systems. Those are formal operational mathematical systems. And in this case, people develop by building on what they already have mastered and combining skills. Now, here's some philosophical and theoretical questions that I believe formal operational adolescents and young adults may now be able to consider, and in fact you see them considering these kinds of questions, but you didn't see this so much in school-age kids. If evolution functions by genetic selectivity, then how might this account for the evolution of behaviors and personality traits beyond just physical characteristics? There's a question for you. If Hitler had never lived, what would be the implications? Politically, in the world today, where would we be? What if you lived on an island, an isolated island with 1,000 inhabitants, and you had to start a new society? Now, dealing with kinds of questions like this, I think, takes a systematic way of going through the logic and following through hypothetical situations. A younger child can ask what-if questions. A younger child could say, what if I had a dog? What would that do? What would that mean? But they have a difficult time with the complex and hypothetical questions like I just mentioned, at least thinking through all of the possible solutions or outcomes in a very systematic manner. You see, even in experimental work, kids will try different experiments. They look for causality, but until they get formal operations, they have a difficult time going through everything in a very systematic way, comparing one case to another case and looking at all outcomes. Some of the abstract and philosophical questions I think that teenagers grapple with come from Erikson's 5th stage of identity development that we talked about previously. What is there about me that forms my true identity? And what do I want to commit to in my life? The level of thinking about those questions, I think show that it's no accident that in Erikson's theory, this kind of identity issue comes up at the same time that Piaget talked about formal operational thinking developing. There's a convergence here. Now, despite the value of Piaget's theory in changing our view of the sequence of development and generating a lot of research and giving us an understanding of cognitive processes, there are several criticisms of his theory. Let me go through some of these. First, many researchers, theorists argue that his basic process, remember the basic process that included schemes, assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration, that this basic process is merely metaphorical. It's impossible ever to disprove it because it is not specific in a way that you can empirically test it. That's true, I think. However, this criticism can apply to many of the concepts of all of the major theorists and theories that we've talked about. In order to develop a general and major theory, it seems to me now that a theorist has to go beyond the specific and concrete data. Indeed, metaphors, such as the process of assimilation and accommodation, have helped a lot of researchers organize their thinking about development and have helped them to guide their research. And in Piaget's theory, the idea of assimilation and accommodation has been taken by teachers and other people and helped guide them in the way they design classrooms and a curriculum. So it's metaphorical, but that's not unusual in the big theories. A second criticism is that there are many recent studies that show that Piaget often misjudged the ages at which children would show evidence of understanding at a particular concept or a particular level. In general, people say Piaget put things at older ages than recent research has shown, whether it was understanding of conservation or the ability to do perspective taking or even certain formal operational tasks. When researchers have simplified the tasks, taken the original tasks that Piaget used and his observations, and found ways to get rid of some of the fluff of the language and got the task down to the bare bones, they've found understanding of a particular concept in children at much younger ages than Piaget had reported. However, if you take the view that development is almost never all or none, but it comes in gradually in steps, and I've mentioned that before as a view that tends to make sense, and if these steps come in over time, then these disagreements over age are not a serious criticism of the theory. Because what it really is showing is, if a task is presented at one level, it comes in at one age. If you simplify it and give a different context, it comes in at maybe a lower age, but it means that part of it's there. There's a germ of this understanding that's developing, not a full-blown mastery of a particular concept, but it is coming in gradually over time. Also, a lot of people forget that Piaget stressed the invariant order of development in his stages, but not specific ages at which a particular skill appear. Because he mentioned ages, people assume that the ages are absolutely a crucial part of his theory, but the ages were just guidelines for him. I don't think he would be thrown off if you found things happening at a different age, so long as you found the logic and the order still there. There's a third criticism. Many people point out that Piaget's focus on development of logical thought, particularly in mathematics and logic and scientific thinking, led him to ignore many other aspects of development. So what I just presented in this lecture concerning formal operational thinking, people have argued, is really sort of narrow in trying to explain everything that we do as adolescents and then on into adulthood. Specifically, Piaget said very little about the role and influence of social relationships. He said very little about emotions in cognitive development. And he also ignored development in several main domains. I think of particularly creative arts, where he really didn't address issues and what goes on there. My answer there is, others have expanded on Piaget's concepts and they filled in some of these gaps. So they've used Piaget's theory but expanded them into social domains and emotional domains. And once again, this criticism could be made of any of the developmental theories. There's no theorist that's claimed to account for development in every domain or for every influential factor. Each theorist has only so much that he or she can do in covering things. There's a fourth criticism, and I think perhaps this is the most serious criticism of Piaget's work. There is a lot of recent research that's now brought into serious question this idea from Piaget that his stages are universal. I don't think it's so much a problem in terms of cultural universality, although we're not sure of that yet. There's been cross-cultural work. It shows, yes, that kids do go through his stages. It's not 100% clear if this accounts for all people everywhere. But the most important problem is the generality of his stages, the universality of his stages across all domains and contexts of development for any given individual. Because I mentioned that for Piaget, he saw humans as developing gradually, but then into a stage, and as the stage was consolidated, it overwhelmed and took over all areas of thinking. Once a person consolidated the skills and understanding at a particular level, then that person could function cognitively in that stage regardless of the particular cognitive problem or domain of knowledge. So for example, in Piaget's view, if a child has reached the period of concrete operational thinking, then she can think in this manner in her dealings in mathematics, science, social relationships, conservation problems, seriation problems, classification, perspective taking, so on. Everything you can mention. She's there. She's in concrete operations. Now, it's true that Piaget recognized asynchronies or lags in the level of development of understanding. By that I mean he realized that you'd find in kids, because he was a good observer, he'd realize you could look at kids and you could see that they would be better or ahead in development in one area and they'd lag behind in another area. Everything didn't come in lockstep synchrony. So there was this asynchrony or lags in development. He saw that. He realized that was there, and he thought it was probably due to contextual differences and environmental differences. But he thought these cases were minor. He thought these were the exceptions. And nowadays, with a lot of research on cognitive development, these asynchronies or lags are considered to be the rule of development. So most people nowadays say that is the way all development happens. Expect it, because that's just the normal way things are. Most current researchers now discuss how a child might use concrete operational thinking on a particular problem, while that same child might use pre-operational thinking on another task and formal operational thinking on a third task. Therefore, most researchers today did not think of a child as being in only one stage. Rather than having general stages, we now have sequences in cognitive skills that are influenced by the child's level and experience in each specific domain and by the demands of each specific task or context. So you might have a lot of lines or courses of development, depending on context and task. Now, there are a lot of researchers out there that people have actually given the name of neo-Piagetians. Remember the neo-Freudians? Well, they're now, Piaget's reached that high level that we can now have neo-Piagetians. People who have been greatly influenced by his theory and are doing new stuff and really changing things. There's some recent research by a cognitive developmental psychologist named Robert Siegler that I think illustrates some of these new conceptualizations of cognitive development that I think his work has modified and gone beyond Piaget's theory. And it's quite interesting and I think quite good. Let me tell you a little bit about Siegler's work now to show you as an example where things are going. Unlike Piaget's model of general stage shifts in understanding, Siegler theorized that there is extreme variability at all times and all levels. I just set you up by talking about this variation. So he believed that at any given age, a child typically has several different strategies or actions that she can use, and she'll shift from one to another of these different strategies on a task. And often a new strategy or a new level of thinking happens once and then doesn't appear again for some time. So rather than thinking, oh, the child now gets it, we see, the child now understands some new way of thinking. No, child's going along, child then shows some new level of thinking or a new strategy, then doesn't use it again for weeks, then it comes back in. So the child keeps using various strategies and simply adds a new strategy to the repertoire of all these different strategies that the child can use. And over time, though, more efficient and adaptive strategies seem to win out and become the predominant or modal way that the child deals with a particular task. And they stay in vogue for the child until a new and better strategy is discovered. But there's always variation. So think of each strategy as having its own course of development over time. And at any given time or any given age, a person may use several of these strategies and have them available. So think of development in terms of not discrete stages, but overlapping waves of skills or strategies. If you could really pinpoint a time and look accurately at what a child's doing, you might see that child at this time is using strategy 1, sometimes strategy 2, sometimes strategy 3, and you could trace the development of each of these waves. Now let me give you a concrete example from a study that Siegler did. This study comes from mathematics, and it concerns a child's initial development and learning of how to count and how to add. We're talking about preschool kids into early school years here, but mainly preschool kids. When children have to add two numbers together, usually they begin by counting all the numbers. Often they use their fingers. So, for example, if a child has to add 2 plus 6, they will count, sometimes on their fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and they'll have 8. Okay? So they're counting all the numbers, starting from 1, going up to the others. And we call this strategy the count-all strategy. You just start with some number and you just count everything. But over time, children very often discover a new strategy, and it's a much more efficient way of counting. What they end up doing is beginning with the highest number, and then they count up from there the other numbers. So, for example, they still have to add 2 plus 6. The first thing they realize, 6 is a big number, 2 is sort of small. So I'll just start 6, 7, 8. Easy. It's a much more efficient way to count. And people call this the min strategy. And it's only with further experience that they'll shift to an even more efficient strategy in which they memorize the sum of two numbers, and they quickly just pull the sum out of their memory. So you now say, what's 2 plus 6? And they go to their memory and they say 8, because they've memorized it. Call this the memorization strategy. So you have the count-all strategy, the min strategy, the memorization strategy. Well, in very detailed observations of children over time, looking at everything they did, Siegler found that they showed a great variability in which strategy they'd use. Although the order of development seemed to be from count-all to min to memorization, they'd usually use all the strategies that they had in their repertoire. And only gradually over time did the min strategy first win out over the count-all strategy, and then later the memorization strategy won out over the min strategy. But at any given point in time, you might see a kid counting everything sometimes, doing min strategy sometimes, and then maybe a little later starting to memorize things. And even after they'd memorized things, they'd bounce back to the min strategy. Now, why would children ever return to a less efficient strategy once they'd learned a better one? Siegler argued that we consolidate our mastery of a new strategy or skills only gradually and only with a lot of experience using it. And so we often fall back to older and more automatic strategies when we're tired, when we're under stress, when we have too many simultaneous cognitive demands placed on us. But as we repeatedly use and master a new strategy, it becomes more automatic and it requires less concentration and energy to use. Does that ever happen to you as an adult? Well, I bet it does. Sometimes I have to confess here, I switch back to the min strategy. Let's say I have a number 53 plus 2. I go 53, 54, 55. Because it's so simple and it takes no thought and it's automatic and it's a simple kid's way of doing things, but it's mindless at this level. So very often when we have automatic skills, we switch back to what would be considered a less efficient skill, but it's not less efficient for us if we've already made it automatic and we use less energy. This was a good discovery, I believe, by Siegler on a way that we constantly develop and learn to use these strategies. In our next lecture, we're going to discuss the last theory in our course, Vygotsky's cognitive mediation theory. I think it provides a nice complement to Piaget's theory, and we'll discuss how that happens. Thank you. Hello. In this lecture, we'll discuss the sixth and last of our major theories of human development, Lev Vygotsky's cognitive mediation theory. We'll discuss his history and how it provided the context for his theory, just as each theorist's history has influenced each theory. And we'll then describe his idea of the incorporation of psychological tools from others and the basic premise that what is intermental becomes intramental, one of his quotes. We'll get back to that. Now, one of the criticisms of Piaget's theory that we noted in the last lecture was that he took virtually no account of the influence of society and social interactions in explaining processes of development. Now, Piaget did try to explain how we think about others, how we learn to deal with others, but he didn't really talk about how others influence us. In contrast, Vygotsky's cognitive mediation theory focuses primarily on how social interactions influence cognitive development. Although all of Vygotsky's work was completed before social learning theory ever came along, and also before there was a cognitive revolution, his theory currently influences developmental researchers and educators in a great way and seems to fit in with a lot of ways that we're thinking about development today. To understand why we had this sleeper effect, if you will, in the influence of his theory, we have to understand Vygotsky's history. Lev S. Vygotsky was born in 1896, interestingly the same year that Piaget was born. He was born near Minsk, Russia, and died in Russia in 1934, at the relatively young age of 37 years. He had tuberculosis, and he'd been quite sick for a good share of his life. Vygotsky was born into a middle-class Jewish family, and like Piaget, he was quite precocious as a young child. He was quite intellectual. In particular, he read a lot of Western philosophy. In fact, he read some of the early work of Piaget. But because of the discrimination against Jews in Russia at that time, he had some problems getting into the education system. He was very much worried because they had a quota system limiting the number of Jewish college students. But Vygotsky, though he thought he couldn't attend college, was lucky and won a lottery and was able to attend Moscow University. He graduated in 1917. Again, it's quite interesting, it was the same year that Piaget received his PhD. And Vygotsky thought that, from this background, he thought that the Bolshevik Revolution would put an end to discrimination against Jews and other minority groups in Russia. He fully welcomed it. And he had been strongly influenced by Hegel's and Marx's philosophies. These philosophies stressed the importance of society and the value of work in helping humans rise to something better. And he believed that this Marxist view, which included a view that technology and tools transform society and help humans to evolve socially, he thought this view could be a foundation for a new Marxist theory of human development, a theory that would be better in accounting for human functionings than what he had read up to that time. Part of this social view of development was a dialectic view of change. In dialectic reasoning, one begins with a thesis, an argument, and an antithesis is presented to challenge the thesis, and then by a combination of thesis and antithesis, a person constructs a synthesis or a new level of argument, a new level of understanding. And this combination, by the way, we've already seen in the complementary and often conflicting processes that we find in other theories. So Erikson constantly talked about the interplay between seeking connectedness and independence, and Piaget had an interplay between assimilation and accommodation. But for Vygotsky, the dialectic was between the individual and others. And in the synthesis, they combined to move development to a higher level of thinking and functioning. And these principles then became the foundation for Vygotsky's theory. Once Vygotsky settled on psychology as his primary field of interest, because he tried out different things and had experience or an education in various areas. Once he settled on psychology, he worked as an academic in Moscow, most of the time in Moscow. His first publication was on the psychology of art, but he wrote about language development and intellectual testing and principles of education. He knew he was sickly. He knew he had tuberculosis, and he knew he probably wouldn't live to an old age. And it seems like he worked very feverishly, as if he had a short time to complete his life's work. Unfortunately, though, even though he probably was the supreme Marxist theorist in human development, at the end of his life, his work was banned in the Soviet Union. Although the reasons aren't clear, and they may have included the fact that he was Jewish, it seems like his greatest sin was that he included so much Western philosophy and ideas integrated and mixed into his theories. Because of this ban, though, Vygotsky was able to publish very little work in his own lifetime. And most of what we have comes from posthumous publications and also the writings of a few students. In fact, he didn't have a strong influence on a wide following, but he had a few dedicated students who paid attention to what he was doing and carried on his work. Carried on his work, for the most part, in the Soviet Union. We had virtually none of his work in English until the 1970s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been an increase in interchange between American and Russian scholars in human development, and this has provided us with many more details and insight into Vygotsky's thinking. I think this explains the sleeper effect. So though he died some time ago, before the other people were coming along with much of their theorizing, his influence has come about nowadays, primarily in the 80s and 90s. And Vygotsky's theory provides a good comparison and a complement to Piaget's theory. Let me see if I can make this comparison. In many ways, a metaphor for Piaget's conceptualization is that the child is a lone scientist. Here's this child out on his own, and through his own actions discovers how the world works and applies his reasoning to various problems and challenges presented by the world. What a great lone scientist there. In contrast, the metaphor for Vygotsky's conceptualization is the child is an apprentice. So this child actively learns skills and symbolic processing by his interactions with an adult mentor. And he incorporates what the adult provides to him in knowledge and in cognitive tools. So in both cases, the child is developing cognitively. But for Piaget, the child was the supreme active discoverer, out discovering things on his own. For Vygotsky, the other person, the apprenticeship to other adults, was extremely necessary. If you recall, Piaget even said, everything you tell a child, you prevent that child from discovering for himself. The view was children will get further if they learn to discover on their own. That wasn't Vygotsky's view. And also in traditional learning theory and in social learning theory, society is thought of as an influence on children's development. Society influences and shapes the child. So is Vygotsky like a learning theorist? Well, in Vygotsky's theory, the child is a part of society, a collaborator in his learning with adult mentors. He isn't simply a passive recipient of conditioning or of socialization. He is interacting and cooperating with the adults or the mentors to learn. So there's a subtle difference here. He's not Piaget with the lone scientist. He's not the social learning people or the learning people where the child is influenced by others socializing that child. The child then, as an apprentice, is working with the adults to develop cognitively. In reality, Piaget's and Vygotsky's theories account for the way children develop. Both of them do. And we might consider them then as important complements to each other, that rather than saying one's right and one's wrong, they're looking at different ways that children learn that both occur. Why do we call Vygotsky's theory cognitive mediation? Well, first, Vygotsky believed we share lower mental functions with other animals. What differentiates us is that we go beyond other animals because of the mental or psychological tools that we acquire to help us think. Now remember, based on a Marxist philosophy, he believed tools mediated progression. And tools became the hot word for him, and he tried to use the idea of tools as used by Marxism in the way of talking about internal or psychological or cognitive tools. Tools made the difference between humans and other animals. The way we acquire a psychological tool is from our culture, and that means from the previous learning of our species. See, with learning theory, outside stimuli elicit responses in the individual. But with Vygotsky, when we acquire a psychological tool, such as language, his main psychological tool, the tool now is a part of our understanding. It becomes our way of thinking. And the tool mediates between the outside stimuli and the responses. So in learning theory, stimulus leads to response. As humans now, stimulus leads to our mediation, our internal cognitive processing, because of our psychological tools, to responses. Our psychological tools then create intentionality and comparisons and higher order planning, and no longer are we at the mercy of outside stimuli as lower animals are. I heard somebody once describe it this way, if I can explain it. He said that once he was trying to do something in the bathroom, to fix something, replace a light that was up high, and he climbed up on the sink, and he was hanging onto the door that was open to reach what he was trying to do. And as he reached, the door started to close. His weight was on the door. He had his fingers on the top of the door, and it started to close on his hands. And he reached to another part of the door, and this weight then forced it to close even more. It was just a reaction to sort of save himself. So far, he's just like an animal. But as it started to close faster and faster because of his weight, he thought through the situation. He thought, now if I keep going like this, my hand's going to get caught in the door. If I shift my weight from the sink and reach over here, I can pull back and then the door won't close anymore. And some way he could make this adjustment. The point is, he wasn't just responding as an animal would. He was thinking through or mediating the situation. And for him, it was almost like he was talking through the alternatives he had. Had to do it very quickly to save his hand. As an example of mediation. Going back to Vygotsky, culture is handed down to us through our society. And our society is handed down to us through the adults in our societies, mainly our parents. So what was in the culture is incorporated into our own cognitive processes as psychological tools that we use. Vygotsky said, as I mentioned already, what was intermental becomes intramental. What was outside between individuals now becomes a part of us. For Vygotsky, we can't function on an adult level without culture, because we bring all of these things in from the culture, and this culture or previous learning that we have is necessary to bring us to an adult level. This conceptualization, I think, provides a deeper level of social interaction than the simple social influence and conditioning that's envisioned by learning theory. Another way of looking at it, as Vygotsky once said, is what Vygotsky said here. A colt is already a horse, but a human baby is only a candidate to become a human being. And so for Vygotsky, you didn't really truly become human until you developed cognition from your culture. Well, what are these psychological tools that came from the culture and are so necessary for our development of higher cognitive processes? It goes back to some of the things we've already mentioned. You hear it again and again. The tools are symbolic. Symbol use seems to be one of those big watersheds in human development. The same symbol systems that we've already encountered in our discussions of Piaget and of others are the primary tools for thinking. For example, language for Vygotsky makes sense, is logically the most important psychological tool. But you also have symbolic play or pretend play. You have art. You have writing. Each of these different kinds of symbol systems. Language is a verbal symbol system. symbolic play is an inactive, acting symbol system. Art and writing are graphic symbol systems, but they're all ways of using symbols. And this description may sound similar to Piaget's description, except for two aspects that Vygotsky emphasized. First, the symbol systems come to us from others rather than from within ourselves. In Piaget's view, we sort of create our symbols and are able to use them. Second, the symbol systems are not just used in our thinking. Piaget said language is a wonderful symbol system that's very helpful for thinking. But for Vygotsky, it goes further. It isn't just used in our thinking, it completely reorganizes our thinking. It takes over our thinking. It's this symbolic mediator or tool that changes everything. So language is the most important tool. Vygotsky described this process by which children internalize language as a personal tool. First, others in the culture obviously provide the child with a particular language and set of symbols. That's absolutely necessary. Others have to have the language and give it to the child. Then as the child masters the language, she begins using the language not just to communicate to others, that's the main purpose of language, but she starts using the language in egocentric speech. She talks to herself, usually out loud. And so you could argue that for Vygotsky, the definition of egocentric speech is talking to yourself, not to communicate with others, but just to talk to yourself. So here's an example. A kid is playing with some toys, playing with Star Wars, let's say, and the child says, now this person comes to the spaceship. He's scared. He walks up to Darth Vader. Now I'm this person. Have you ever heard kids talk like that? They sort of switch in their play from dialogue to narrating the story to being stagehands and giving directions to their characters, and often they're doing it out loud. This is egocentric speech. And then with more experience, the child's able to eliminate the overt speech and internalize the egocentric speech. Or it becomes partially internalized. So sometimes for us as adults, and certainly for children, we talk out loud, but we don't say the whole things. Say, darn, now I have to do this. Darn, go here. You just say little pieces. And children start doing this also. So Vygotsky's view is what was outside the speech that the child learned from the culture, these symbols, child practices, guides himself or herself through speaking to herself, and it starts becoming internal. The child's still talking to herself, but now it's only mental. Eventually, this inner speech becomes the mediating tool for the child's thinking. So she begins using automatic and truncated speech to think, to plan, to direct herself. It's no longer speech for communication, where it started. It's now a personal psychological tool that changes all her thought processes. It came from others, but now it's part of the child's mind. Although language is this primary tool, other symbolic tools become internalized as well. So mathematical thinking can become internalized, visual thinking can become internalized. And there are many examples in both children and adults of egocentric speech. In one example, and I was present when this happened, we were some friends, and this preschooler's mother told him to go to his room and put on his pants and shirt. We were going to go somewhere. And he was a little kid. He was about 2.5 or 3, just getting used to trying to get dressed on his own. And we were in the other room waiting, and we heard this little kid in the other room say, label in the back, label in the back, label in the back. And we realized he's repeating the instructions for how to put on his shirt and his pants that his mother's provided to him. He's giving himself directions. And he's giving these directions out loud. And it occurred to me that I'm an old guy. I put on my shirt maybe 10 or 20 times in my life, and I still say to myself, but it's now truncated, it's inside, I say to myself, label in the back. I can sometimes give myself instructions when I'm trying to figure things out like this. I've given this example before, but here's another one. You as an adult are driving down the road, you're trying to follow some directions, it's not automatic where you're going, you haven't gone there often, but you have directions. And as you go along, you think to yourself, go 2 lights, then turn left. Look for the red house. And you give yourself these directions. So when you consider how you think, very often you use symbolic devices that are derived from inner speech to guide your thinking, your planning, your actions. And the argument is, even when we're learning new things, when we're thinking through ideas and alternatives, we're using this inner speech. But it becomes so inner and so automatic that we may not realize that we're using this speech. That was Vygotsky's view. This process of internalization from others doesn't carry the connotations of conditioning or behavior modification that learning theory does. In conditioning and behavior modification, even though if a child cooperates, it goes easier, the idea is of a more passive person that's being conditioned whether the person cooperates or not. But in Vygotsky's conceptualization, the child is an active processor. The child is cooperating in this joint regulation. The child's doing it. Now, Piaget had a view of egocentric speech as well. In fact, Vygotsky probably stole the term egocentric speech from Piaget, from some of Piaget's early writings. But Piaget had a different view of it. They disagreed. For Piaget, a child in egocentric speech was really being egocentric. It was a lack of perspective taking. The child was in some ways talking past another person, not taking account of what the other person knew versus what the child himself knew. So egocentric speech is where you talk about things and you're not making any sense to the other person. It's egocentric. You're taking only your viewpoint. In Vygotsky's view, egocentric speech is talking to yourself. Let me give you an example of Piaget's egocentric speech. At one time, for a short time, for a summer, we had a family live next to us who were from Switzerland. In fact, interestingly, the man in this family was a student of Piaget's, had received his PhD with Piaget and was a professor. And they were living there, and we had little kids, preschool kids, and they got together and met for the first time. And his kids spoke only French, and our kids spoke only English. And I watched them interact. They were watching TV and they were playing with some toys. And it was strange. If we had turned off the sound, it looked like they knew exactly what each other was speaking. One person was speaking French, one kid. The other person was speaking English. And they were just talking about toys and talking about TV and going on. And I know they didn't understand what each other was saying, but they just kept talking. In Piaget's view, that's egocentric speech. One kid said, "It was my birthday yesterday. I got a lot of presents." The other one said, "We're going to McDonald's after we leave here." And the other one said, "I really love Darth Vader and Star Wars toys." And the other kid says, "I'm going to get chicken nuggets." That's egocentric speech, whether it's in the same language or not. Let me give you another example. There was a child at a show and tell in preschool, and he had brought in, it was in the autumn, and he had brought in a large leaf, and he was telling the kids about the leaf. He said, "I got this leaf out by the garage. It came from the big tree." And it fell down from the big tree, and I was watching the kids, and they were all nodding, "Oh, yeah, yeah." And they said, "I got it with my friend Kevin." And another kid all of a sudden looked sort of confused and said, "I'm Kevin." And that's how the conversation went. And I'm thinking, they're nodding. He hasn't taken account that they don't know which tree he means or which garage. He doesn't say, "I got it by a large tree that's by my garage." He said, "I went out and got this leaf by the garage from the big tree with Kevin." That's egocentric speech. He's failed to explain things and make sense of what he knows and they don't know. I bring that up only to say that both Piaget and Vygotsky were probably right. They used egocentric speech in reality to describe different processes. In one case, Piaget is talking about this lack of perspective taking in speech, sort of passing each other, not taking account of knowledge. In the other case, Vygotsky's talking about how we end up talking to ourselves and it becomes internalized and becomes inner speech, you see. But there are two processes that probably both exist. Let me point out another comparison between Vygotsky's view and Piaget's view. And this is the two views they had of pretend play or symbolic play. For Piaget, pretend play, symbolic play, was an immature process. It developed after kids had symbol use, and it was predominantly assimilation. It distorted reality. And he was right. So, for example, when a child simply takes a block of wood and pretends it's a car and drives it along, vroom, vroom, he's distorting reality because a block of wood really isn't a car and isn't too much like a car. He's not paying attention to the features and the characteristics of the block of wood as a block of wood. He's thinking car. He is assimilating in the sense that he's using his car scheme and applying that to the block of wood in pretend play. But he's not accommodating, he's not putting it all into balance. And so in pretend play, whether we play the role of another person or we use an object as a substitute for some other object, we use props, we change the situations, we distort reality. And as Piaget looked at that, because he was already hung up because of his theory on how assimilation and accommodation should be in balance to really have adaptive thinking and understanding, he was led, I think, or maybe even biased in his theory, to look at play as being an immature and maybe a second-rate process that occurs because kids really aren't very good at putting assimilation and accommodation together when they first start out using symbols. However, Piaget did see a value to play. He could see that because kids distort reality, because they assimilate so much, they didn't have to worry about all of the demands from reality. If you don't have to worry about it in some ways, if you can distort it in that way, you can act out things that are your own problems. And he actually borrowed from Freud here and talked about how in play, it is almost like we have a projective test and we can almost do therapy on ourselves. We can act out situations where we had problems or where we didn't understand stuff, and we can act it out again and again to try to understand it. So he saw some value in play, you see. In fact, there was a case once where some little kids saw a film about childbirth, a very graphic film, as preschoolers. Probably they weren't ready for it. They didn't seem to be upset. They were sort of surprised, but they weren't upset. The adults asked them if they had any questions. They said no. A few days later, they'd taken some of their action figures and pulled the arms and legs off the figures and had one figure with the legs spread apart, and then were going through birth, trying to put the dolls back together and acting out birth again and again and again, trying to act this out. Almost like they were trying to understand what was happening. For Piaget, though, play drops out around the school years when operational thinking comes in and we now have a much more efficient process that's more adaptive. Vygotsky, though, looked at play and he had the view that pretend play isn't a second-rate process. It isn't a problem of adjusting to reality. Play, in fact, is the area where the child performs at his very best level, at the highest level of his skills, at the edge, the upper edge of his abilities. He can practice things that he doesn't practice otherwise. Now, for some of the same reasons, play doesn't require that the child do something for an external reason. You can still, it isn't real. You don't have to worry about failing or about the risks involved. If you pretend to be chased by a tiger, there's no chance that a real tiger is going to catch you and eat you, to be extreme. You don't have to worry about things, so it makes play a nice, safe place to try things out. But it's because of this safety, because of the chance of having others help you along and the culture help you along, that in Vygotsky's terms, you can do things at your highest level. So, for example, children can practice being patient or being mature or acting like parents and acting out the roles of taking care of a child, things they couldn't possibly do in real life. But in play, they can practice these roles and get better at them, or at least see how it feels. Try out, handling different heavy and serious emotions in play. One child was hiding out from some dangerous monsters, and everybody had to be extremely quiet in their hiding places. He had to go to the bathroom very badly. It was extremely uncomfortable for him. But he stayed in this place for a long time, quietly, something he would never do in his real life. He did it well beyond his abilities because he was in play. And the support from others in the context gave him this chance. So for Piaget, play was a second-rate process that worked for a while until something better came along. For Vygotsky, play was the leading edge. Here's another comparison of the differences between their theories, and we're going to explain how that fits in our next lecture when we talk about adult-child co-construction and some of the other important contributions of Vygotsky. Thank you. Hello. In the last lecture, we introduced Vygotsky's theory, and today we'll conclude our discussion of his theory. One of the most important contributions of Vygotsky's theory has been the concept of the zone of proximal development. I'll explain that concept and then discuss an attendant concept of scaffolding. And then we'll discuss the process of co-construction that falls under this view of scaffolding. And we'll conclude our discussion with how these concepts, these ideas apply to education. In the previous developmental theories that we studied, there was one assumption in all of them, and that was that children progress along some given course of development towards some endpoint of mature and adaptive functioning. So even if you take the view that a development occurs throughout the lifespan, one of the primary endpoints that people look at is children make it to adulthood. And at the adult mature level, we take that as a goal, if you will, at least an automatic goal in development. And then we try to pinpoint where a child is along this path. And this is most easily seen in stage theories, such as those of Erikson and Piaget. At any given time, then, the child's thought to be at some distinct point along this course of development. And we're not always good at figuring out exactly where it is, but in theory, if we were perfect in our knowledge of development, we could find it. For Vygotsky, there wasn't a single point of development. Instead, an individual's level of development varies across some fuzzy range along this course, some zone. According to Vygotsky, the zone that covers an individual's current developmental level stretches from the level at which the child has already completely mastered skills, the lower level skills, and then stretches to the other end, the upper limit of the individual's capacity, where that child can use a skill or know something only in the very best of circumstances. The lower level of the zone is called the actual level of development. And in Vygotsky's terms, everything below this level has already been mastered. That's the past. That's what happened in the past. The upper level of the zone is called the potential level of development. And everything above this level or outside of this level is not yet achievable by the person. It's beyond his limits. That's the future. And by the way, everything beyond that isn't possible even if you really try hard to teach kids something. So if you really try hard to teach a 2-year-old to drive a car, it's beyond his level. He can't do it for various reasons, some of them physical. Everything between these two levels is in the zone, and it's potentially achievable by the person. This is the present. So it's this zone that the child is working in at a particular time. I'm trying to draw this out with my hands, but think of it again as this course, this line of development, and you have some zone along this line. The actual level is down at the lower end. Everything below that the kid has already mastered, is really good at. The potential level is up at the upper end. Everything above that is beyond the child, and this is the zone the child is currently working on. And across the time, this zone moves, and it moves along in development. but it's the entire zone that moves. Okay, this area is called the zone of proximal development, proximal, because this range covers the problems and challenges and tasks that are proximal or next to the person's last fully developed level. So why did Vygotsky propose a zone rather than a distinct point in the course of development? As Vygotsky observed, whether or not a person can perform a task or successfully solve a problem depends on many, many environmental factors. It depends on whether a problem is worded clearly, whether the problem or task is a simple version or a complicated version, whether someone else is helping the person to do the task, whether there are aids and cues that are given to do a task. These things seem so obvious, but sometimes we're forgotten by Western and American psychologists and developmentalists as they tested kids. You see, some tasks aren't very challenging because they're very similar or highly similar to what a person already knows. Other tasks are more challenging because they're simply more complicated, or they require a person to perform without any help. So, for example, if you're a student taking an exam, a final exam for a course, if the exam is simply recall, it says, tell me what this is, this concept. That's a lot more difficult, at least in theory, than a multiple choice exam that says, what is the definition of this? And it gives you several choices and you have to choose. And you already have cues. You already have something in front of you that you have to recognize. You see? So for most people, just pulling something out of your head with no help is more difficult. You can make exams more difficult or easier, even to test the same kind of information. Let me give you an example in terms of children. And remember, for Vygotsky, we're always talking about cooperative development. We're not talking about this lone kid out developing. We're talking about the kid developing in terms of having somebody to help or mentor or be an apprentice to this person. Here was a true example of some fathers and sons that as a group were building birdhouses together that they were going to then display in some situation. And the kids were at different ages, but all school-age kids. And they had different levels of abilities, as did the fathers, by the way. For the youngest boys, there were kits. There were kits. There were directions on how to build a birdhouse. And for the youngest boys, the fathers read the directions, explained the use of the tools, did most of the measuring, and sawed the wood pieces. They nailed the pieces together. They did most of the painting. So you saw some cases where they talked to the kids, they let the kid hammer for a while and do a few things, paint. But the fathers did a heck of a lot of the work, and they were working together on it. But for boys a little bit more experienced, the fathers told the children how to do each step and would let the children do most of it. However, I noticed in this group that the fathers sawed the wood. They were afraid to let the kids get a hold of these saws. They let the boys do most of the other stuff. For the oldest boys, the kids that seemed to have more experience, the fathers simply watched. They gave suggestions from time to time. But for the most part, they sat back, the boys did it. In each instance, there was an appearance of help that seemed to be at a different level in the child's zone of developing construction skills. So the level of help varied depending on how advanced and how good these kids were. Now, in fact, you could have taken any level of help and picked out any boy and given this help to this boy, and the ones where the fathers did it all would have been at a very easy level. In fact, it might have been below the child, below the zone. And help when the fathers just sat back and did almost nothing and made suggestions might have made the task extremely challenging to some boys. Maybe they could do it, but it would have been tough. Let me give you another example. A kindergarten girl was learning to read with her mother. And at first, they together chose the books that they would read, and the books they chose first were ones with large pictures and only one or two words on each page. You know the types of books. The words were simple and they were often repeated. So it would say, go, go, go. And the next page would say, we go, or something like that. Later on, when they read these books, the mother would usually say the word first, and then the girl would repeat the word. Later, after the child mastered these easiest books, often through simply memorizing them or learning what words went with which pictures, they then looked for books that were a little bit more difficult. There were a few more words, the words were a little harder, and the mother tried to get the girl to guess at what the words were, and then tried to sound them out from the letters. But the mother would help with part of the sound. Maybe the girl would get the first letter of each word, the sound, and the mother would say, can. And after more time, they chose books that were had more complicated sentences, and the mother let the girl do more of the sounding out and reading without the mother's intervention. And eventually they chose books that were mostly writing with very few pictures, and the girl either recognized each word or sounded out most of the words without the mother's help. Finally, the girl read books without the mother even being present. Should be typical kind of sequence in learning to read. At each instance, though, this mother and this child showed a different level within the child's zone of reading development. And you realize that some things that the mother did with the child made the task really easy, and some things that the mother did made the task extremely challenging. So at any particular level of the child's reading, a mother could choose to do things or present a situation that was tough for the kid or very easy for the kid. But it was all within the zone of what the child was working on at this particular time in her life. In each of these examples, at what point would you be able to say, this child has now developed that skill? This boy now knows how to build birdhouses. When did that come in? Or this girl can now read. When do we say that? See, there's no single point at which the child's developed this skill and didn't have it before. So that's why Vygotsky argued to call it a particular point is misleading. It's impossible to find. It's a whole zone. It's better to say, where is the child at in development? Within this zone. That's where the child's at. And it will depend on the context and the task. It won't be a single point. And it goes back to this view that we never have an all or none development. Development is always a little less, a little more, a gradual development till we get something in. When do you learn to read? It's not all or none. When do you learn certain mathematical concepts? It's not all or none. When do you learn to swim? It's not all or none. So how does a person progress now through this zone of proximal development? Well, first, as a person develops new skills at some high level of mastery, then both her actual level and her potential level increase. So think of this line of development again, and as you develop new skills, your actual level comes up. But as your actual level comes up, what you've already mastered, so does your potential level. The zone moves up. And with mastery, the entire zone moves along the course. See, this zone is always dynamic. It's never static. As you're developing and as you're learning, the zone is constantly moving as well. Second, Vygotsky never meant that a child had only one universal zone of development that spanned all tasks and all domains. Each different domain, for example, construction of birdhouses or reading or something else, was likely to have its own dynamic zone. You couldn't just say, this is the zone a kid's in. And third, we would expect to find individual differences in a person's zones of development. Individual differences across the zones of that person, and certainly individual differences with some other child. So in any given domain, a child's zone might be further along than another child's zone. One child's reading zone might be here, another child over here. That seems obvious. One child might also progress faster than another child. So the zone moves along faster than some other child. And the span of the zone from the actual to the potential level might be wider or narrower for one child. Maybe this child can work within a wide zone and another child only works in a narrow zone. It's all fairly theoretical at this point. Zones may expand in how wide they are or narrow. This is the theoretical part. It's a good way of thinking about it. It's very imprecise when you're really trying to do measurements of specific zones for a person. But for Vygotsky, what was the mechanism of development? Because of instructions, cues, and assistance given by someone else, a child is able to handle more and more challenging problems, and eventually a child learns to handle problems without the help of others. So once again, remember what we said last time, once again, society and adults cooperate with the child in providing the tools for development. As we mentioned in the last lecture, help from someone else is then internalized and becomes a part of the child's own repertoire. So the zone is where this help is provided. What has already been developed, now the child is internalized and can do without help. Jerome Bruner was a developmental theorist and researcher who coined the term scaffolding to refer to this cooperative help from others and also from the environment. It's a nice term, I think, that sort of captures what we mean here. You see, if you think of physical scaffolding in the construction business, in building, scaffolding, although it doesn't really hold up the building, it certainly holds up the work that's in progress. The scaffolding supports the building project at the level where the current building is going on. So beginning with a building, you build the scaffolding sort of low. As the building progresses and is built, the scaffolding needs to be changed. It needs to be placed higher up to keep at the level of the construction of the building. It's no longer required on the lower levels. And in fact, you can take stuff away from the lower levels and keep building it up to the higher levels. So this is the metaphor for all kinds of developmental tasks. Scaffolding also really does support what's going on in development at the time. I think of a very simple but very physical example of scaffolding. You want to take a picture of your new baby because she's so cute, and she's only about 4 months of age and she really can't sit up on her own. So you put her on the sofa, or you put her with some things, and you prop her up with pillows to take the picture. That's really physical scaffolding, to have those pillows there. You don't put them there once she can sit on her own. You take the scaffolding away. So adults add scaffolding at the edge, the higher edge of development, but they remove it when some levels have already been mastered. And in addition, scaffolding makes no sense if you're putting the scaffolding at a level beyond the developmental work that's occurring. To put it up too high is just crazy. So in the birdhouse construction example that we gave, the fathers in effect provided scaffolding to their son's construction of the birdhouses. They systematically removed the scaffolding when it was no longer needed. That is for the tasks that the children could do on their own. And in the reading example, the mother also provided scaffolding to her daughter's reading by helping and giving cues that were right at the edge of her daughter's abilities. She also removed help as the daughter could do the tasks on her own. And she added higher level tasks like more words, fewer pictures, which again required more help from the mother. You see how that works? Now I say they did this correctly, assuming they were good scaffolders. So one can see that the process of scaffolding is this dynamic process. They're constantly shifting levels. And I just mentioned that. The adults in the culture, in the society, can be good scaffolders or lousy scaffolders because they have to be in touch with the zone for a particular domain of development and for a particular child. Scaffolding is not effective, again, if the adults provide help well beyond the child's zone, at levels that that child can't master even with all the help, or below the child's zone of proximal development at levels the child's already mastered. Let me give you a few more examples of this scaffolding process within a child's zone of development. This research comes from different people, but one of the primary researchers that's done work here is named Robin Fivish, and she and others have completed research on the co-construction of narrative memory in children. And the idea here, the buzzword is co-construction. Let me give you an example and then I'll explain that. In observations of children, where the children were then asked to tell about something that happened, she discovered this. In just sort of natural situations where you have the mother and child talk, she finds that typically a parent and a child usually, quote, co-construct the narrative account. In other words, the parent provides cues as to what happened and helps the child recall events. the events then become more permanently encoded into the child's memory. So co-construction goes like something like this. And she found this, by the way. You can see this easily if you look at parents and children, how they talk. But you come home, mom's gone to the zoo with her daughter this day. Her daughter's maybe 3, 2.5 or 3, let's say 3. Comes home and says to Dad, "Oh, we had a great day at the zoo, didn't we?" The girl says, "Yeah." Says, "Well, why don't you tell Dad what we did at the zoo?" And the girl just stands there sort of in a stupor, doesn't say anything. And the mom says, "Come on, do you remember what we did at the zoo?" Kid doesn't say much. And the mother says, "Do you remember when we saw the elephants? Remember when we saw the elephants?" And the girl nods and said, "Yeah, what did the elephants do?" And she said, "Swish around." "Oh yeah, you saw them swish their trunks around. Did they eat something?" And the girl said, "Yes." And they said, "What did they eat?" The girl said, "Hay." And then the girl says, "And they threw it on their backs." And Mom says, "Yeah, they threw it all on their backs to keep the sun off." And then what did the elephants do? And the girl says, "Drank." Said, "Did they drink water?" "Yes." And the girl says, "With their trunks. And we saw bears." She says, "Yeah, we saw bears too. And what did the bears do?" And she said, the girl says, "The bears slept." "Yeah, they didn't do too much, did they?" The girl said, "No, they didn't do very much at all." And then they go on like this, and you say, "And then what happens is we got popcorn." "Oh yeah, we had popcorn to eat." And the girl said, "And lemonade." "Yeah, we got lemonade to eat." And she says, "Now I got a shirt," the girl says. You see how the conversation goes? So within this process, it's impossible to say what the child remembers and what comes from the parent. If afterwards you're saying, "Does this child remember the trip to the zoo? Does she have some narrative memory? Can she recount it?" Well, young children would not remember most sequence of events that happen in their lives without the initial aid of the parent recalling the event with them. It doesn't happen without the child and the parent co-constructing the memory. But just as in this case I gave you, as the parent adds cues and tries to draw it out of the children, children will then see the associations, and as they say one thing, they'll remember something else and bring part of it about. And eventually, they actually will say more and more, and they get pretty good. They learn, they not only improve their memory, if you will, they learn how to tell stories, how to tell about narratives about what happens. Okay? A lot of people have argued, well, when you have these early memories from childhood, do you really remember it? Or in fact, you just remember people telling you it happened, your parents telling you it happened? You ever heard that before? That's an old idea. And maybe some way after they tell you enough times, you think you actually remember it. This kind of co-construction research, the view of a Vygotskian approach, is, in fact, it is you remembering it, but only in conjunction with somebody else also telling you. It's not all the other person, it's not you. Things come from our cooperation in learning and incorporating things. Now, it's interesting how you can use this kind of co-construction. Robin Fivish also did some research on narratives and parents talking to their kids, and discovered a way of looking at how we learn gender differences, how boys and girls maybe feel things and talk about things differently. And this is a little different than the standard case of, oh, we just condition them. We reward girls for doing girl things, and we reward boys for doing boy things, and they have to learn what's appropriate. In this case, it wasn't that way. It was more co-construction. She discovered in taping and watching a lot of conversations of mothers with their children that the moms would talk about emotions. And the moms didn't even realize they were doing this. But with the girls, they would talk about more emotions than they would with the boys. So if the girl fell down and skinned her knee, they'd say, "Oh, you got hurt. Does that really hurt?" And they'd say, "Yeah." Say, "Well, what happened?" And they'd talk about it. And the girl says, "It hurts. I cry. I'm sad." And say, "Oh, you really feel sad. I know how that feels." And they'd go on and they'd talk about it. And they'd elicit it and they'd bring it out in the child. So there was more talking about sadness and feeling happy and feeling scared. And for the boys, they just didn't talk about the emotion. "Oh, you fell down and got hurt. Let's see if we can clean that up." and get on with it, except for anger. Mothers would talk more about anger with their sons than they would with their daughters, but the other emotions they talk more with the girls. And surprise, surprise, boys will talk about anger and seem to feel it, but they seem to be thwarted in talking about or feeling so much fear and sadness, or at least expressing it, maybe already feel it. In some ways, there's differences you can see. And maybe it comes in some parts from the way we co-construct our narrative and our way of expressing these things. It isn't like a parent saying, "Oh, don't talk about those things," to her son. She never says that. It's just this co-construction of the narrative and the account of what's going on. Let me go back to another case. This is of pretend play again. I know in the last lecture we talked about Vygotsky's view of play versus Piaget's view of play, of pretend play. Let me go back now and put Vygotsky's view of play in the context of the zone of proximal development and scaffolding within that zone. Vygotsky believed that in social pretend play, that is symbolic play that the child carries out in conjunction with somebody else in a social context, the play itself provides the scaffolding for the child's development through that child's zone. And it's the social scaffolding that really becomes often very important. Play first requires that the child concentrate on meanings of what she's doing, the reference for the various objects, and doesn't focus just on the objects. In other words, symbol use develops. You can distance the symbol from the referent. But when the child pretends to be in a particular role or carrying out actions appropriate to that role, she's often, as we mentioned, performing actions that are well above her zone in real life. For example, a girl might pretend to be a mother and take care of a sick baby. She's trying out responsibilities and stretching herself beyond what she can really do. And other players will often push a child to stay within the rules of the game and how to do it. So, for example, a child might be really frightened because the child's playing a superhero, and maybe it gets a little out of control and the child really does have some fear. But the child has to act at not being frightened. So social pretend play often teaches children responsibilities, how to respond in certain situations, and emotional control, discipline at the edges of their abilities. Play then, for Vygotsky, was scaffolding within the zone. It meant you could go higher. It made some tasks easier than they would be without this help. Play for Vygotsky demonstrated the leading edge of development. It created this zone for the child. It led to where the child was going. For most other theorists, Freud, Erikson, and Piaget, they looked at play as a reflection of what the child already knew or believed, but not the cutting edge of that child's development. Now, there's also a difference in the way we look at learning. For Vygotsky, learning leads development. We learn through this cooperative process, this scaffolding process. And so for Vygotsky, learning is the highest level we can get. Learning then brings along our development. For learning theorists, and for social learning theorists, such as Bandura, learning is equated with development. They're one and the same thing. They really don't look at development as being a separate process than learning, because their focus is on the environment influencing the child. For Piaget, development comes from within, and it comes before learning. It makes possible learning. And you learn all kinds of individual things, but it's because you've already developed some way of thinking, some mental structure. You see the difference? Learning comes first for Vygotsky. It's the same thing as development for the learning theorists. For Piaget, development comes first, and now you can use that to learn all kinds of things. Maybe this is just a different way of looking at things, but in fact, it might also give you a way of teaching and looking at the world. Vygotsky's research had a great influence on education. Teachers really picked up on this, and they still do today. The idea of scaffolding, the idea of co-construction, had a big impact on teachers. Teachers use this idea of adjusting instructions to the current zone of proximal development for their student in a particular domain or class. But you realize when you take this approach, it requires that teachers focus on individual student levels to determine what's a challenge, what's accessible to students. A good teacher is someone who can determine the appropriate help to give a student at an appropriate level on a task with the right amount of examples. A good teacher must also know when to withdraw help and scaffolding so you don't bore students. And this is true at any level of teaching, whether you're preschool or high school or college or even in adult classes. So good teaching means that the teacher has to begin with what the student already knows and then take the student with the scaffolding to new challenges beyond. This approach, though, has weaknesses, both for education and in general for Vygotsky's approach. This zone of proximal development and the idea of scaffolding is great, but it's still a metaphor like so many other concepts that we've encountered. And a metaphor is not easily proved or tested or disproved. The value seems to be the way it organizes and guides our thinking and teachers' thinking to look at things. It's also logistically difficult for a teacher or anybody else to possibly assess where a child's actual levels are and potential levels and figure out the precision of these zones that are constantly changing. So it's a good way to guide your approach to education or your approach to development. It's hard to be very precise about it. In conclusion, the main theoretical constructs, that is, the emphasis that Vygotsky provided, seem to be very healthy additions to other theories. But the ideas might be a little limited in their applicability. The most important result seems to be the conceptualizations that have influenced education and teaching. Next time, we're going to have our concluding lecture and see if we can put together some of the ideas and integration of various theories. Thank you. Hello. In this concluding lecture, we will discuss how different theories may give us partial understandings about human nature, and we'll discuss possibilities for integrating these theories. And we'll conclude with a reprise, an assessment of where you stand as a student regarding some of the major issues of human development. Let me begin with a well-known story, a well-known metaphor that I think is appropriate to use as a model for how we might compare and integrate the 6 theories that we've discussed in this course. In this story, there were 6 blind men who approached an elephant to discover what kind of creature the elephant was. The first man happened to fall against the elephant's side, and he declared, "Oh, this elephant, this kind of animal is like a wall." And the second man ran into the tusk, and after feeling it, exclaimed, "Ouch, oh, the elephant's like a spear." The third man grabbed the elephant's trunk, and as it swung around, he said, "Elephant is like a snake." Elephant's a kind of snake. And the fourth man held onto the elephant's leg and exclaimed, "The elephant is like a tree." The fifth man chanced to touch the elephant's ear, and as he held it, he said, "The elephant is like a fan." And the sixth man grasped the elephant's swinging tail and said, "Oh, the elephant's like a rope." Now, because of the personal experiences of each man, each came up with a different conception of this animal, the elephant. And although all were partly right, they were all wrong. So like the blind men and the elephant, does each of our 6 theories and the theorists behind them give us a partial understanding of human development, or worse, a very false and biased understanding? Well, the answer probably depends on what you or what a person does with each of these theories. If you use one theory only with the belief that a particular theory is the best explanation for human development, then you will have one view, and I think it will be a very biased and false view. But if you realize that each theorist was biased by personal experiences and focus, and the focus they had and their dealings were with only one piece of the whole picture, you maybe will be appropriate in using a theory appropriately. See, each theory must be used with a view of the context in which it was developed and also the purpose for which it was developed. Let me review these very briefly. We started out with Freud's theory. Freud's theory dealt primarily with unconscious conflicts and emotionally charged issues that formed one's personality. He contributed an awareness of the importance of the unconscious, a very strong contribution from him that we forget that he contributed often because it's become such an implicit part of our thinking today. He also talked about multiple motivations, often unconscious motivations. We often want things, but we want different things at the same time. He was biased, however, by a desire to explain certain kinds of psychopathologies and to develop a type of therapy, the stress of his theory. And he tried to squeeze everything through sexual drive, as I saw it, and it biased his approach to explaining these motivations. The second theory, Erikson's theory, dealt primarily with development of identity and the development of the joint issues of connectedness and independence. He contributed, in my opinion, a very nice guide to the issues we face throughout the lifespan and the sequence of focus that we have on these various issues. But he was biased by his own struggles with identity confusion as he grew up. And he seemed to need to reconcile his theory with Freud's stages. If he had broken away and didn't have that initial conception, maybe he would have developed other approaches to looking at these concepts. The third theory was the theory that was given us by Bowlby and Ainsworth, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And their theory dealt primarily with the development of close relationships and the functions of close relationships, of this attachment system, reciprocal attachment that develops. Their theory seems to have worked in that it has generated a lot of research, and from that research, a lot of new findings about how attachments form and how relationships affect subsequent behaviors and development. It has very solid applications. As we mentioned, it's already been used to change around the way we handle children going into the hospital, the way we handle separations, necessary separations of children from parents, the way we handle foster care. But Bowlby saw development as somewhat instinctual, almost maybe more than was needed. Ainsworth saw development as primarily tied to whether the parents were good or bad and consistent as parents, maybe more than was needed. The theory doesn't explain a wide range of development, but rather than saying that's a major criticism, it was never intended to explain everything about development. Bandura's theory dealt primarily with how we learn through observation, how we learn by imitating others, and how our self-efficacy, our beliefs about what we can accomplish and what we can affect in the environment, influences our development, what we will try, what we will expect will happen. This combined theory has been very effective in generating a lot of applied programs for treating phobias and having people learn not to be fearful, for looking at people who give up trying and how to help them to have a different sense of self-efficacy and learn that they can accomplish certain things. It's also given us models of dealing with aggression in our youth and the influences that affect people becoming aggressive. But Bandura didn't focus very much on the importance of childhood per se, or on the developmental issues and processes that occur at different ages. Piaget's theory dealt primarily with how we change our cognitive skills over time and how we develop intelligent thought processes. His theory generated, probably more than any other, generated thousands, literally thousands of studies. And because of that, we have a lot of knowledge about the normal course of development of children, what they can do at different ages and how they develop. We have information that we never had before Piaget. But he seemed to be biased toward a kind of thinking of logical, mathematical operations. And this for him was the highest form of intelligence. And even though that might have been helpfully shortchanged more social, emotional, and creative domains of development. Also, it seems to me and to others that his stages may have been much too rigid in the way he looked at them. The sixth theorist, and the last theorist, Vygotsky, and his theory dealt primarily with how we interact with adults to incorporate important symbolic tools from them, and then how the adults aid us in our development. And he influenced the way we look at effective cooperation in helping children to learn, how we approach education. But his theory was somewhat narrow in what it covered. It only covered some aspects of development. It didn't even try to cover everything. And the precision of his processes is lacking. His theory helps us to have an approach to education and to development, but not so much to lay out a very specific way of assessing a child's level of development. We should be able to combine and integrate these theories to organize our thinking regarding the different aspects and domains of development. I can't do all that integrating for you. I think that maybe you can do it as you think about these theories, but let me give you some examples. In one instance, we could use Erikson's theory to talk about the major issues that we face, combined with Bowlby's and Ainsworth's theory to discuss the processes whereby trust and connectedness develop as a foundation for subsequent autonomy and independence. Looking at that early development, both Erikson and Bowlby combined could give us a good view of how we put these together. Let me give you another example. We could use Piaget's theory to provide some structure for understanding how we approach new information from the environment and the general sequences of shifts that we make in our thinking. But we could combine that with Vygotsky's theory to add some insight into how others help us to actually gradually become more independent in our problem solving. And put these together, there's no reason that these two theories in this regard are in conflict. They should be able to go together. However, there are contradictions between theories in some aspects, because in many cases these theories are based on opposing worldviews. If you recall, we talked about a mechanistic worldview and an organismic worldview. And it's probably impossible to integrate everything, just like it's impossible to believe that any one theory is completely correct. Let me give you now one example of an explanations of some aspect of development that was actually provided by three of these different theories as a way of comparing them. In some ways you can integrate these approaches, but in some ways they're contradictory. And this is an explanation of gender role development. This is a good comparison. Let me start out with giving you a background for gender role development. During the preschool and early elementary school years, children develop this firm conception of what it is to be masculine and what it is to be feminine, and the attendant masculine and feminine behaviors that go with these gender roles, and how the role of each sex functions and differs from the other sex's role. Let me take a break for a minute and just tell you how currently people use sex and gender. Even though these words are used interchangeably, at least in the field of development, people have tried to use the word sex to refer to the actual differences between the two sexes. So my sex is male, and your sex may be female. Sex refers to anatomical differences and everything that is absolute or physically real. Gender then is used to refer to the attendant roles and behaviors and attributes that go along with any particular sex. So my gender may be masculine, my sex may be male, but my gender may be masculine in the sense that my gender includes a lot of things: preferences, attitudes, the way I behave, other things that I've learned. Except in some rare cases, I really can't change my sex. Tough to change gender as well, but I at least have learned my gender in theory. Now, by the time you look at this tape, this lecture, those conceptions may have changed. People are always using these words interchangeably and trying to figure out how to use them. But I'll try to use them in this way. These conceptions are called gender roles, and they're believed to originate not only in our biology, but also in the beliefs of our culture. They come from both. Everybody knows that. But some people are very passionate in their extreme beliefs that either biology matters most or environment matters most, especially specific cultural values that we get from our environment. And that these, either biology or the environment, really determines, for the most part, the specific gender roles that develop. Some argue that development of a gender role is normal and valuable for subsequent development and functioning. They think it's good. Others believe that we'd be better off and we'd have more optimal development of children if we could be freed from all gender roles, from separate gender roles, we could all be alike, and they would even strive for that. Some believe that's a possible accomplishment. Others believe that condition is impossible. You'll never get there. You may have noticed this intense personal concern and debate in some people, and you certainly see it in some developmentalists and in parents and in educators. But one thing everyone agrees upon, and that is, not only do children develop an understanding of gender roles, but they also incorporate these gender roles into their own identity. The gender role becomes important for identity. In fact, some research has shown if you give kids a lot of different conceptions and you give them choices of how they classify themselves, do they identify with this or that? You give them age differences, ethnic differences, or racial differences. You give them sex differences. Sex wins out for most kids. Sex is a core construct of who we are and our identity, and comes in fairly soon, by the later preschool years. As I mentioned, 3 of our theories attempted to explain how this development occurs and what the motivation is for children to develop these strong gender conceptions that we all know are there. And the theories are Freud's psychodynamic theory, Bandura's social learning theory, and Piaget's cognitive developmental theory, although Piaget's cognitive developmental theory is shown as it was interpreted and used by Lawrence Kohlberg, not by Piaget himself. So each of these sequences that I'm going to give you as this example is presented as if a preschool boy, in this case, can state what he's thinking and feeling, even the unconscious thoughts and desires. Each case is sort of set up like a syllogism, if you will, or a way that the child goes through his reasoning to come to his conclusion. Remember, this is the way that they think these gender roles develop, but it's not that a child would actually be conscious of it and be able to talk about it in this way. So first, let's start with Freud's theory. According to psychoanalytic theory, this is the following sequence that occurs. And it's based on the Oedipal desires, one's Oedipal desires, and the resolution of these desires. The development of gender role identity is initiated from within the child based on his or her own desires. So remember, I'm taking the boy's viewpoint now. The boy starts out saying, I want my mother as a love object. To get her, I must be like my father. And therefore, I want to be a male like my father and do masculine things. See, it comes from the desires for the mom and how you resolve that with the dad, and you learn to be masculine. Let me give you the next one. This is social learning theory, and this is the sequence that occurs. It's based on one's expectancies. Remember Bandura's theory? The beliefs one has about reinforcement contingencies, what will be reinforced. The development of gender role identity is initiated from the environment socializing the child, but of course the child has to believe and learn to believe what will be possible. And so it starts out with the boy thinking, I want reinforcement. In other words, I want good things to happen. And I've observed others, and I realize that I get reinforcement when I do masculine things because they get reinforcement when they do masculine things. Therefore, I want to be a male and act like males act. You see, it starts from wanting reinforcement, seeing how it's done in society. It comes from outside in. This is the last theory. This is according to cognitive developmental theory from Larry Kohlberg. This is the sequence that occurs. It's based on one's categorization of things in the world, including social relationships. The development of this gender role identity is initiated from within oneself. In this case, the child does it to himself and seeks it out. It starts out this way. The boy thinks, I have discovered that I'm a male, and I'm going to stay a male. Well, if I'm a male, I want to be a competent male. Therefore, when I do masculine things, I'm competent. A different approach. Now, the empirical evidence that we know so far doesn't really provide much support for the psychoanalytic explanation that children that resolve their Oedipal conflict appropriately and identify have stronger gender role development. However, there's been a lot of empirical evidence that supports both the social learning view and a cognitive developmental account of this. See, the social learning account focuses on what comes from the environment. The cognitive developmental account focuses on what comes from within and how we socialize ourselves. It assumes that a child needs a prerequisite understanding of his own sex and identity before the gender roles can even be learned. And in fact, this is shown to be somewhat true. Kids have this sense of sex conservation, even in the preschool years. That is, they learn first that we have labels, that we call some people boys and some people girls, or some people women, some people men. And they learn to be able to identify pretty easily who's called what. They also learn that once you get this identification, once you have this label, you stay in that label. And there's a period of time when they're a little confused about that. So often kids will say, when I grow up, a boy will say, when I grow up, I want to be a mommy. And somebody will say, you can't be a mommy. He says, why not? He says, because you have to be a girl to be a mommy. And he says, well, then I'll be a girl and be a mommy. They think that, sexes are sort of interchangeable. You do what you want when you grow up. But they learn fairly quickly that's not possible because people tell them, and they also observe that there's conservation of sex across changes. So, for example, a boy's mom has long hair and goes out and gets a haircut and comes home with very short hair, and the little kid goes crazy and is upset because it's a conservation problem. Is that still his mother? Can he still see the identity of his mother? If he learns that, yes, she's still mom, he might learn things like moms can wear pants or dresses, they can change styles, and they're still mothers or they're still women. And men can change styles and do different things, and they're still men. You stay you stay the same, okay? Once they've learned this, then, in that cognitive developmental approach, then they say, well, I am this. And now I have to start paying attention to people that are in this role. So most researchers today some way combine these two accounts as the best explanation. Let me give you one more story about this. Recently, we had a visit from my oldest son, who is an adult, a young adult, and is living away from home. And we went on a hike. And one of my youngest sons, my younger two sons, they both adore him. And when they're with him, because they don't get to see him too often, they pay a lot of attention. And they love being with him. And I observed them on this hike, and it was very interesting. So one of the younger ones, looking up to his older brother, walked along and ended up doing everything the older son did, everything his brother did. When the brother walked up on some rocks a particular way, the other one would walk up that way. When the older one took off his shirt and tucked it into his belt, the younger one took off his shirt and tucked it into his belt. When the older one went up to one area to look out, the younger one went up there. When the older one ordered something in a restaurant, the younger one ordered the same thing at the restaurant. And so far you could say, boy, this is imitation. And this is imitation based on maybe this view, this social learning view of vicarious reinforcement. They also talked to each other, but I also discovered something else. It wasn't just imitation, it was something that I'd call co-construction of their roles from Vygotsky's theory. Not only was the younger one imitating the older one, but together they were sort of working out what you do. So very often they'd talk about it. The younger one would say, what do you like? What happens here? The older one would say things like, don't do that. Don't you like this? And together they sort of co-constructed what I'd call masculine roles. So the older one was a role model for the younger one in terms of gender roles. But it was a combination. It wasn't blind imitation only from outside in. It was also a co-construction, a combination. That's just an example of maybe how you can put these kinds of things together. as a final assessment, I want to return to some questions that we asked in the very first lecture. This was a test I gave you concerning where you stood as the student on various major issues of development. Now, you should see if you've had any changes in your thinking. You should recognize that certain of the themes in these questions, themes that might be more familiar now that we've talked about the different theories, and you might recognize that these issues or the answers really can't be proven or disproven, but they guide one's theoretical leanings. And we'll see if you really think the same way or not. Now, I'm going to ask these as multiple choice questions, so for each question, you have some alternatives. Choose in your gut level what you think best matches your belief. The first question is, children are, and alternative one is, creatures whose basically negative or selfish impulses must be controlled. The second alternative is, neither inherently good nor inherently bad. And the third alternative is, creatures who are born with many positive and very few negative tendencies. Now, this question addresses our conception of the basic nature of humans. The first alternative came from our early conceptions of this person born evil and born with a lot of negative characteristics. But you may recognize that in many ways it matches Freud's theory. Not completely, but a theory that looked at these internal conflicts, this selfishness, these problems that people had and had to then cope with and work out. The second alternative matches Locke's philosophy, that is, of people being born neutral and more or less blank, ready to be molded. It also matches other theories from the learning theory tradition and more of Bandura's approach. And the third alternative matches Rousseau's philosophy, that people are born good and left to their own devices will develop optimally. And this matches Piaget's theory of the normative optimal development of children. Let me give you now the second question. People are basically active beings who play a major role in determining their own abilities and traits, or passive beings whose characteristics are molded by either environmental or biological factors. And you may recognize now that this question addresses our basic worldview of either an active organismic approach to humans or a passive mechanistic approach to humans. The first alternative matches Piaget's theory. We're active in that we seek out and initiate our own development. The second alternative matches Bandura's theory of observational learning, though Bandura changed a little bit with his self-efficacy theory. Let me give you the next question. When we compare development of different individuals, we see, the first alternative, mainly similarities. People develop along universal paths and experience similar changes at similar ages. Or the second alternative, mainly differences. People undergo different sequences of changes and have widely different timetables of development. This question again addresses the issue of an organismic approach that focuses on universal norms of development versus a mechanistic approach that focuses on individual differences. Now, the first alternative matches Piaget's theory. The second alternative better matches Bandura's theory. Where does Vygotsky's theory fit in here? Vygotsky really stressed individual differences, but he certainly had a view of the normative development of these cases. Here's the fourth question. Biological influences and environmental influences are thought to contribute to development, both. The question is, though, overall, alternative A, biological factors contribute more than environmental factors, or B, biological and environmental factors are equally important, or C, environmental factors contribute more than biological factors. This question addresses the relative influence of nature versus nurture, or biology versus an environment. All the theorists believe that both factors are important, but Bowlby's theory part of his theory focused more on biology, even though Ainsworth, who combined her theory and her influence on Bowlby, focused on environmental factors from the parents. And Bandura's theory focuses more on environment. Have you changed your basic conceptions regarding these issues from the beginning of this course? Have you changed some of them? Or have you possibly found any way to see human development and human nature from multiple perspectives as they relate to these questions? That you really can't see it as only one way. That's good too. As a final question you could ask about these various theories, can we apply these theories when they talked about child development to development in adulthood and old age? Although most of the theories, these 6 theories, dealt with development during childhood and adolescence, they each provide explanations for developmental processes and models that are part of our basic human nature. Thus, these processes and ideas should be found at all levels. As an example, the conflicts, often unconscious or only semi-conscious, that drive us, the motivations to want conflicting things, some of our motivations being very selfish, some realistic, some of them more idealistic. Does it sound like Freud's theory? This stuff seems to play out for everyone at all ages. And I think Freud would have agreed that this is part of our human nature. I believe we do deal with issues of our identity and our commitments to various courses of development, and we certainly see this in children and particularly in adolescence during the identity crisis, but we see it in middle age, we see it in older adults. We deal with who we are and our commitments at different times in our lives. We constantly deal with our attachments to others in close relationships. It comes out again and again in what this means. So let me just say, in our final conclusion now about this, this is our human nature, this combination that I think these theorists have picked up. In the case of human development, we indeed do see the little child in the adult and the fully developed human adult in the little child. We're the same just as we're different. Thank you.